Hey there. Tonight we're exploring why it sucked to be a pioneer on the Oregon Trail, from sunrise yokes to creaking wheels. Not the Hollywood version, you know. The real grind was bad. Water, bulky oxen, and busted axles, not ambushes at high noon. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step onto the prairie, thinking this is a road trip, and the road immediately fights back with diarrhea, dead oxen, and wine that tastes like baking soda. That glossy poster in your head, free land under a big sky, clean mountain air, sunshine on a wagon canvas, turns into 4 to 6 months of walking beside a creaking 300-pound wooden box while your lips crack and your bacon goes rancid. You gamble your family, your savings, and your sanity on a 2-0-0-0-mile dirt line called the Oregon Trail, and the house usually wins, not because of arrows and shootouts like the old movies. The real killer is microscopic and lives in your drinking water. You go because everyone else is going. Talk of the Willamette Valley spreads along the Mississippi like wildfire and booster pamphlets. Oregon Treaty finalized with Britain in 1846. Donation Land Claim Act of 1850 promises 320 acres to a single man, or 640 to a married couple if you get there before 1855. The phrase 54 degrees 40 or fight still rings in newspapers, even after the compromise line at the 49th parallel. The Great Migration of 1843 proves it's doable. Around 875 to 1,000 people make it, led by practical types like Peter Burnett and the Apagids. Word on the street is Eden, with rain. Word on the trail is dust. Your budget bleeds before the first mile. A decent prairie schooner, not a giant Conestoga, runs $75 to $100. Oxen at $25 to $30 per head. And you need a team of 4 to 6. A family of 4 can sink $600 to $1,000 in 1840s money before the latch on Independence, Missouri even clicks shut. The gear list from people who actually survived reads like a nightmare grocery run. Per adult, around 200 pounds of flour, 150 of bacon, 20 of sugar, 10 of coffee, salt, and anything you can smoke, dry, or otherwise abuse into keeping. Army Officer Randolph B. Marcy later writes The Prairie Traveler, 1859, with sober advice. Leave the furniture, bring needles and spare axe handles, and do not overload the wagon. He's right, and you ignore him anyway. Cast iron stoves and fancy trunks look good in your yard. They look less good when your oxen bog down in mud on day 3, the company meeting in Independence. St. Joseph or Council Bluffs is your 19th century group chat. You elect a captain because a piece of paper with signatures feels like order. It does not fix the reality that your company is a flimsy coalition of strangers with mismatched goals, mismatched tempers, and mismatched oxen. The ground rules. Move at dawn. 10 minutes per halt. Strict watch on livestock. No shooting near the herd. Last until the first thunderstorm hits. The wagon circle at night isn't a medieval fortress. It's a convenience store for hooves. You're corralling cattle and mules, not forming a last stand. Day 1 out of Independence tastes like optimism and gunpowder. Green recruits lean loaded rifles against wagon wheels while fixing a trace chain, and the jolt sends a bullet through a calf or a thigh. Accidental shootings are a top-tier way to ruin a morning. Within a week, the roadside starts to look like a yard sale you will regret forever. Chairs, bureaus, pianos, cast iron, and boxes of treasures dumped to lighten the load. By Fort Kearney, the Platte River's south bank is a line of regret and dead oxen. That river is your first long-term relationship. The Platte, so broad and shallow in places that it sprawls into several braids, with bottoms of quicksand and banks that come and go. Mark Twain, writing after the trail years in Roughing It, called it too thin to plough and too thick to drink. And even if you don't know Twain yet, your lips know he's right. The real threat is invisible. Cholera. The 1849-1855 pandemic rolls up the Missouri Valley. Like a stealth army, you scoop river water with hands that just handle cattle, cook over buffalo chips, and bury latrine sites too close to camp because the wind is fast and your patience is short. Vibrio cholerae thanks you for the hospitality. The symptom list reads like a horror poem. Cramps, rice water diarrhea, sunken eyes, dehydration so rapid your skin tense. Mortality without treatment can hit 50% or worse. Trail math gets dark fast. Out of the roughly 400,000 emigrants who go west between the early 1840s and 1860s, for Oregon, California, and Utah, credible historians like John Unruh Jr. estimate tens of thousands die on the way, most from disease. The Oregon-California Trails Association and National Park Service syntheses put emigrant deaths on western trails at around 20,000 total, many in a few brutal cholera years. The trail is not a duel. It's a lottery with bad water. You walk. Everyone walks. The wagon is not your Uber. It's your cargo van. A typical prairie schooner measures roughly 10 to 12 feet long, 4 feet wide, canvas stretched over bows. Loaded properly, it might carry 2,000 pounds. The wheels are iron-rimmed bone rattlers. You let the kids ride, only when they're sick or when the day's mileage has to be scored with tears. 15 miles is a strong day, 20 is heroic, and more often you crawl at 8 to 12. At that rate, 2,000 miles is 4 to 6 months of sun, wind, and the smell of sweat and rancid pork. Oxen power your trip. Horses get the glam shots, but oxen eat grass, pull like furry tractors, and don't spook as easily. When they do spook, you discover what 2,000 pounds of muscle does with panic. Stampede is an ugly word. It sounds almost fun, until you see wagons tumbling and yokes twisting, while 3 of your neighbor's cattle go airborne. Buffalo gnats and mosquitoes form clouds so thick you breathe them. Black flies can suffocate a calf. The wind scours your face with alkali dust, and your eyes sting until you pray for rain. When rain comes, it turns the road into glue. Fort Kearney appears around 250 miles out, a line of low buildings and a flag telling you civilization exists in small, expensive doses. Imagine your local gas station with a monopoly on water, flour, and nails. Flour prices go up as you go west, especially during the 1849 gold stampede. Traders sell you bacon the color of a bruise, and you buy it. You also buy laudanum, camphor, and assorted patent medicines that claim to fix everything from cholera to heartbreak. Laudanum quiets crying babies and murdering pain. It also does nothing for dehydration. The fort soldiers do not save you. They nod. They stock trade goods. They sometimes bury you. Fort politics looks stable compared to your camp. The first big drizzle brings on the first big argument. Captains resign, factions break off, and your constitution gets smudged with beef tallow and regret. John MacFaragher's study of overland diaries, women and men on the overland trail, reads like a chorus of fatigue. Women cooking, hauling water, tending kids and the sick, then walking. Men drive teams, fix wheels, and shoot when there's game. Everyone shares the fun of washing bacon brine out of barrels, only to discover the staves leak and your breakfast is now a salt lick. The geology becomes your mile marker. Courthouse Rock, Chimney Rock, Scott's Bluff. These are the Instagram backdrops of 1849, and everybody's feed is the same. Scribbled names in wagon grease and watered ink. You make it to Fort Laramie, around mile 620, and learn that cholera hits the Platte Valley like a scythe. Worse in the early 1850s. Diaries stack up with lines like "buried 3 today" and "left a child at sunrise." Graves get disguised. People bury their dead in the middle of the trail, so the next wagons will pack the earth down and hide the soil from wolves. Tender mercy, hard economics. River crossings are roulette wheels with oars. Ferries pop up every season, and the operators set prices like they read your mind. At the Platte's better ferries, you pay $1 to $3 per wagon. At the North Platte above Fort Laramie, the toll can spike. You face a choice that defines the trail. Pay the toll or try the ford. Fording is cheap until you lose an axle, or a child, or the whole wagon. Some people caulk the wagon box and float it. Caulking works until it doesn't. A loaded wagon rolling underwater becomes a coffin on spokes. Even if you make it across, the oxen still have to swim, and they swim like rocks with horns. You top out at South Pass in central Wyoming at roughly 7,412 feet and feel a hope spike that tastes like thin air. The continental divide here is not a jagged wall. It's a broad, gentle saddle, the route indigenous people used for centuries, then fur traders, then missionaries like Narcissa and Marcus Whitman in 1836. You stand in wind and sagebrush and carve your name on Independence Rock like thousands before you. The granite reads like a small city phone book, a sediment of longing. You tell yourself it's all downhill from here. It is not. After South Pass, the land turns to high desert with names you can taste. Saleratus Lake. That crust on the flats is sodium bicarbonate. You scoop it to bake bread and brag about chemistry, while your stomach gears up for a mutiny. Alkali dust scours teeth and gums. The water in some creeks leaves a chalky film on your tongue. Your oxen stagger after miles without decent grass. If you choose the Sublette Greenwood cutoff to save time, you cut out Fort Bridger and its supplies, and in exchange you get a 45 to 50-mile waterless stretch where you drive the animals all night to reach the Green River. The gamble pays only if the weather smiles, and your team holds together. A thunderstorm on Alkali Flat turns the earth into dish soap and drags your wagon wheels to a halt. A breakdown becomes surgery you perform with a hand-forged wrench and a prayer. If you detour to Fort Bridger, about 100 miles southwest of South Pass, you meet Jim Bridger, mountain man turned entrepreneur, or at least his prices. This is where you pay for advice, cattle shoes, and things you should have brought. From Bridger, you head northwest through Bear River country and Soda Springs, where the water literally fizzes from dissolved CO2. Emigrants' diaries gush about washing clothes in sparkling water and boiling coffee that tastes faintly of Tums. You pass by Hooper Springs and Nature's soda fountain, and you get a reminder that the earth is alive in every way. Fort Hall on the Snake River is another Hudson's Bay Company outpost turned American checkpoint. From here, wagons peel off for California down the Humboldt, while you stay with the Snake toward Oregon. The Snake River looks tame until the channel twists and deepens, and the banks turn to quicksand. Three Island Crossing, near present day, Glenn's Ferry, becomes a notorious gauntlet. You line up wagons, unyoke cattle, and push into the current with ropes, shouting without asking for heroics, because heroics drown faster than ropes break. You learn the weight limit, of hope. Graves along this section are thick as fence posts. Indigenous nations are part of every day of this trip, whether your camp acknowledges it or not. Oto, Pawnee, Cheyenne, Lakota along the Platte, Shoshone and Bannock in the Bear and Snake Country, Cayuse, Umatilla and Walla Walla in the Columbia Plateau. Trade happens constantly. Salmon, roots, moccasins, information for beads, cloth, tobacco, ammunition. The cliché of constant Indian attacks comes mostly from later novels and movies. The number of emigrants killed by native people on the overland trails sits in the low hundreds across decades, not the hyperbolic thousands. John Unruh's classic study, The Plains Across, estimates on the order of 362 emigrant deaths from native conflicts between the 1840s and 1860. While emigrants killed a comparable or larger number of native people, and disease spread by newcomers killed many more. The 1847 measles epidemic among the Cayuse, linked to diseases carried by moving populations, decimates communities and triggers catastrophic events like the attack at the Whitman mission. The trail is not just hard on you. It's a slow-motion disaster for the people whose lands you march through. Nightlife on the prairie is equal parts relief and duty. Cows wander unless somebody watches them. Coyotes sing like a jury that has already decided. Someone plays a fiddle. Someone else mixes cornmeal in bacon drippings and calls it a treat. A wedding happens in one camp, a birth in another. Amelia Stewart Knight writes about giving birth on the trail in 1853 as her family approaches the Columbia. One family becomes orphaned in 1844 when both parents, Henry and Naomi Saga, die of sickness, leaving 7 children who end up at the Whitman mission. The trail hands out story arcs you do not want to own. You're constantly recalculating time. The entire journey has a brutal schedule, hidden in the sky. If you leave too early in spring, the rivers are swollen with snowmelt and you drown crossing. If you leave too late, the Blue Mountains and Cascade Snows trap you in October. Between Fort Hall and the Dalles lie the Badlands of Fatigue, Sagebrush Flats, Heat, and the Snake's Basalt Canyons. You enter Boise Valley and taste green again in willow shade. Then Fort Boise, ramshackle trading post turned checkpoint. Supplies here cost whatever the market will bear, which is usually whatever you have left. The Blue Mountains in northeastern Oregon are not blue with kindness. The road climbs, switchbacks tight, timber thick. You unyoke teams and double team wagons up short, vicious pitches. A wet September turns the track into grease. Trees splinter, wheels groan, and your oxen blow. Descents are worse. You chain wheels, cut a tree as a drag brake, and ride your wagon down a slope that does not love you. A runaway here is not dramatic. It's a series of cracking sounds followed by quiet that aches. The Blue Mountains break people more than bandits ever did. Then you hit the Columbia River bottleneck, the Dalles. This is the choke point. Before 1846, your options make you choose your poison. Build rafts and shoot the Columbia's tumbles and narrows. Then the Cascades Rapids with family and everything you own on wet planks. Or wait for boats, expensive and rare. Or stay put and starve. Many choose the first path and pay in lives. The Barlow Road opens in 1846 thanks to Samuel K. Barlow and a team that cuts a toll road around the south flank of Mount Hood. It is not easy. It is not cheap. It beats drowning. Early tolls run around $5 per wagon and small fees per head of livestock. The sum your budget hates and your bones accept. Laurel Hill, a notorious section, is a steep volcanic slope where you let wagons down by rope, wheel hubs smoking as if they're on fire. You walk that last stretch stunned and quiet. Because either you can see Green Valley in your mind, or you can see ghosts on a river bend. After all that, the Willamette Valley does not instantly turn into paradise. It's damp, it's forest, it's malaria-prone in the lowlands. In the 1830s and 1840s, you scout, you stake, and then you chop. Donation claims mean measuring and paperwork. Winter comes whether your roof leaks or not. Clearing a claim is years of work, but at least you're not on the road. Your body keeps the receipts of this trip. Scurvy is real. Fresh vegetables are rumors until you find wild onions, berries, or a trade for potatoes with a mission or a farm. You wake up with sore feet every day because you burned through shoe leather walking the equivalent of New York to Miami in a few months. You don't count the days. You count the graves. You can name the dangers, like a litany. Disease at the top, always. Then river accidents. Then runovers from wheels, and falling under a wagon while reaching for a dropped spoon, and getting dragged by a yoke. Then gun accidents. Then weather. Lightning storms on the plains that flatten tents, hailstones that smash fingers, wind that peels canvas from hoops. Then animal trouble. Stampedes, predators taking calves, oxen poisoned by alkali water. Snakebite exists, but does not star in many funerals. The diaries and the data line up. The Oregon Trail is less Wild West shootout than gross domestic product of misery and determination. Myths hang on this story because they're tidy. The circle, the wagon's image, sticks because it looks brave and symmetrical. In reality, the circle is a corral so livestock don't wander, and so kids don't get trampled at 3 a.m. People line up their wagons in a V or a straight line, just as often, because the terrain dictates shape. The myth that men do all the hard labor evaporates in the wash water. Women cook for dozens, care for the sick, load children like bundles, and on many days, drive teams while the men scout or fix wheels. Diaries from women like Narcissa Whitman, Abigail Scott Duniway, later, and Amelia Knight frame the trip in a tone that is not romantic. It's a list of tasks done to the edge of collapse. Another myth insists that friendly native people constantly guide you. Some do trade directions and warn about bad crossings. Some do not interact. Some lose patience with the way emigrant herds tear up meadows and spook game. Hostilities spike in the 1850s and 1860s for reasons that do not fit in a campfire story, including U.S. military forts multiplying and emigrants treating grasslands like free hay. The treaty politics and broken promises stack up off to your north and south as you push wagons through 1,000 tiny trespasses. Conflict death totals on the trails, measured in the hundreds, pale next to deaths by disease in the tens of thousands. But the damage to native communities is profound and chronic. Guidebooks compete for your trust in the way apps compete now. Lansford Hastings writes The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California in 1845 and tells people to try cutoffs that promise to save time. Some cutoffs nearly get people killed. The Meek cutoff in 1845 strands families in central Oregon, sage with little water. The Applegate Trail in 1846 offers a route into the Willamette that avoids the Columbia but costs time, cattle, and sanity. People with good intentions force new paths into being with blood and broken wagons. Your choice to take a shortcut is less strategy and more meteorology. You learn fuel economics the hard way. Trees vanish on the plains, so you pick up buffalo chips by the bushel. They burn hot and smokeless, which sounds great until you get a breeze in the face that answers the question you promised not to ask. In the mountains, you burn green wood that smokes like an insult. Coffee becomes more important than you want to admit. partly because it masks the flavor of bad water, and partly because caffeine is a legal stimulant in 1851. Sugar rations feel like treasure. If you're lucky, you shoot antelope or bison early on. Later, gain fins near the trail, because 400,000 people over 3 decades turn a hunting corridor into a conveyor belt. Law on the trail is a social contract stapled by fatigue. Companies adopt rules and mail them to themselves in their heads. Thieves exist. A few men get whipped or expelled for stealing. Some get lynched. Rare but real. Most disputes resolve in the currency of distance. People get fed up, hitch up, and move on to another cluster of wagons. The captain position rotates or evaporates. You discover another truth. A wagon train is not one thing. It's an accordion. It stretches and squeezes and plays out of tune. Your body adapts to a routine that would shock your winter self. Wake at 4, eat quick, yoke the oxen, move by 6 to beat heat and wind. Halt at noon for shade if you can find any. Move until sundown. Unioke, water, graze, cook, stand guard, sleep, like someone who has no better option. Repeat. On top of that routine, the trail sets small traps. Waterholes look decent and carry enough bacteria to write their own diaries. Alkali flats look smooth and swallow wheels. Snow in late spring falls near South Pass and gives you a preview of death. You do everything right and still bury a child with a board for a headstone and 2 lines in a diary for an epitaph. At Fort Laramie, you watch a soldier's coat fade and realize the US. Army is an observer in your story, not a shield. At Fort Hall, you watch the will of a neighbor collapse. At the Dallas, you watch the gorge tug rafts into a choke. At Laurel Hill, you watch ropes smoke on tree trunks. Those images replace whatever painting of Oregon you started with. Then you walk into the Willamette Valley and face a different kind of hard. You trade sunstroke and cholera for rain, brush and blisters with moss on them. The trail is a machine for stripping illusions. You start with a brand new wagon, a $10 tinware set, and a plan to arrive with dignity. You end by cutting down a tree to stop your wheels, swapping a quilt for a bag of flour, and dragging cattle across a river with a lariat that used to be a clothesline. You start with a fear of Indian attack and end with a fear of the water in your own bucket. You start with a plan to eat bacon every day and end with a craving for anything green. You learn that every pound matters. Flour, not fancy. Nails, not novels. Needles, not nonsense. The numbers keep you honest. Assuming you do 15 miles per day on average, which is generous. 2,000 miles means 133 days if you never stop for repairs, storms, births, or funerals. You stop a lot. That's why most companies leave late April or early May and aim to be off the mountains by September. The Barlow Road toll eats $5 from you, when $5 could have bought 25 pounds of coffee or 100 pounds of flour in Missouri. Fort prices climb with your desperation. In 1849, a pound of flour can cost 50 cents or more at some posts, compared to 2 to 5 cents back east in a good year. You feel the gold rush like a traffic jam that starts 3 states to the south and still pushes prices north. You also learn to read landscape like a book. You see buffalo wallows and know where not to pitch your tent. You see a cut bank and know where not to ford. You see a willow fringe and smell better water even before your mouth can tell. You learn to distrust dry washes and fresh green, because freshets can rise stones in minutes. You learn that a grizzly hide hung on a stick means a dead ox nearby and water that kills. Your brain becomes a survival app coded in dirt. Trail medicine is a cocktail of experience and bad theory. The prevailing medical mindset in the mid-19th century talks about imbalances and miasmas. In practice, you use what you have. Bleeding and calomel purges do harm as often as good. Whiskey and laudanum do what they always do. Camphor and peppermint ease nothing but morale. The real trick would have been boiled water and hand washing with soap and a clear latrine strategy. Most companies learned some version of that by June, and the mortality curve curves down with each lesson. The problem is the months when people are still learning. Grave markers sometimes get carved with names, sometimes nothing. A plank, a rock cairn, a bit of wit scratched into soft stone at Independence Rock or Register Cliff. Oklahoma, Indiana, Ohio. Names cut into granite like they mean it. The trail registers feel like a social media feed that ends every third post with a list of the dead. Merrill Mattes, writing in the 20th century about Nebraska landmarks, notes how those carvings layer into a palimpsest of stubbornness. You add your name because existing is defiance. You move on because stopping is death. The best days are still astonishing. A night on the Platte when the stars go right down to the horizon and the sky feels like a book open to the good page. A dawn in sagebrush with a chill and a hush and the kind of smell that should have a better word than sage. A morning when the wheels roll so easy you forget your toes hurt. A day when trade brings fresh salmon from Umatilla people on the Columbia and you taste oil and smoke and vitality. Those days do not erase the others. They just keep you going. By the time steel cuts the continent in 1869 and the Transcontinental Railroad makes crossings in a week rather than a season, the Oregon Trail starts turning into a memory and then a myth. The freight companies keep using parts of it. Cattle drives cross pieces, but the emigrant wave ebbs as faster, safer options creep in. Markers go up. Schools teach a simplified version. Computer games immortalize a few phrases and a few jokes. The real story persists in a million words of diaries and letters. It says the same thing over and over in different handwriting. This was hard, and most people who died did not die in the way the movies show. You carry the meth and the mud into Oregon. You reach Oregon City or a claim above the Yamhill and count how many from your original company walk into the same clearing. Not all. Somebody fell to cholera near Fort Kearney. Somebody didn't make Three Island Crossing. Somebody left small shoes on the Blue Mountains. Somebody arrived and kept going south. Because California rumor paid better. Somebody turned right at Fort Hall and never saw the Willamette. You show up and you breathe. That alone is bigger pay than any promise on a land office form. The deal always had fine print. Free land is not really free. It's seized and reallocated after treaties made and broken. You stand on someone's former home when you cut your timber. The land you call opportunity is a wound in someone else's map. You walk through a catastrophe you do not fully see. A demographic collapse from disease that hits indigenous nations with terrifying speed. The Oregon Trail is not just a personal test. It's a continental reordering with a body count. The brochures forgot to print. Still, you put a roof on. You plant potatoes. You clear stumps, cuss at rain, and turn into the kind of person who measures days in chores done. The worst nights are behind you, and somehow also still visible, like a line of campfires slipping over a rise. You become the neighbor someone else meets when they arrive in 1852 or 1853, and you tell them how to avoid the bad ford near the Umatilla, how to line chain wheels on Laurel Hill, and how to find decent water on a draw outside of Fort Boise. You give them coffee that isn't entirely blackened by alkali, and you do for them what someone did for you. The list of reasons it sucked becomes the list of reasons it didn't beat you. Disease, river, dust and miles, hunger, blisters, and bad advice printed in neat fonts. Group dynamics better suited to theatre than logistics. Everything that made you curse also made you a practical expert on wind direction, wagon grease, and the science of not dying. You kept a journal, or you didn't. You learned to boil the water because you had to, not because Marcy said so. You learned to tie a clove hitch. You learned that fire goes out in the rain, and that buffalo chips are an underrated carbon source. You learned to respect oxen like they were teammates, not machines. You learned who you were when the wind slid under your hat and whispered nothing about mercy. Under the big picture numbers, your story fits into a pattern historians have measured. Around 400,000 people move west between roughly 1841 and 1869 on the various overland trails. Of those, a significant number head to Oregon before the gold rush changes the traffic. Death estimates range widely because record-keeping collapses in hailstorms and river bends. But credible syntheses land near 20,000 dead across all the trails, many from cholera in a few bad seasons. That's a mortality rate in the low single digits to around 5%. Roughly 1 out of every 17 or 20, depending on the year and the route. The biggest killer is disease. The most famous danger is not the one to fear. The wagons you picture are the wrong wagons. The attacks you condense into a movie scene rarely happen. The real visuals are quieter. A hand feeling the axle hub to see if it's warm from friction. A woman balancing a kettle while the wind tries to take it. An old man recutting a shoe for a limping ox. A child asleep with dust in the corners of their eyes. You do not get to pick whether the trail is glorious. You accept that it is grim. You keep walking. Your lungs fill with a kind of air that is 90% grit and 10% hope. You balance the ledger every night, what you lost and what you didn't. The Oregon Trail is a teacher with the bedside manner of a shovel. It takes and takes and takes until you prove you can keep something. And then it lets you keep a little. It hands you a valley, wet and green and stubborn, in exchange for every easy thing you ever believed. At some point, the numbers fade and the names matter. Your company isn't a statistic in John Unruh's tables. It's the Boyds, or the Sages, or the Knights, or the Apagots. Your memory of the Platte is not a salinity reading. It's a taste you will never forget. Your opinion of oxen is not a theory about draft animals. It's respect that grows out of calloused hands. Your grasp of the West is not a map line. It's a hill you climbed above the Umatilla that showed you everything at once, including the thing you didn't want to see. The cost. You live. You tell it. You leave out the part where you cried because of a bent axle and a broken cup, and you include the part where you held a rope and your boot slid, and you did not let go. Future people turn your misery into an arcade game, with pixelated cholera and oxen that collapse on schedule. The game gets one thing right. It lets you fail for dumb reasons, just as often as big ones. It understands that on the Oregon Trail, the small miscalculations add up until the ledger comes due. That's the secret nobody prints in broadside advertisements in 1843. The worst part of being a pioneer on the Oregon Trail isn't one terrible, cinematic moment. It's the grind, the miles, the dust, the bad water. The grind is the villain and the teacher, and you share a campfire with both. You walk into Oregon with your ankles shredded and your head up, and the valley does not clap. It just waits for you to pick up an axe. You would swear you hear the faint rattling of wagon wheels behind you, but it's only the wind. The trail always recedes in the rear view, even as it etches itself in bone. Next, let's turn our attention to The rise of the Persian Empire, Achaemenid glory. Babylon, October 539 bus. The richest city on earth goes quiet. The river slides under its walls, the bronze gates stand, and yet the city changes hands. It isn't a legend, a clay tablet. The Nabonidus Chronicle states it bluntly. Without a fight, the new master is Cyrus II, called the Great. He arrives not as a looter, not as a one-night conqueror, but as the head of a machine that has eaten kingdoms for breakfast and will keep swallowing them until nearly half the humans alive answer to one crown. This is not a fluke. It's the reveal scene to a 30-year sprint that built the biggest empire the world had seen. The Persians don't begin as an obvious superpower. They start as a highlands community in Fars, southwestern Iran, calling themselves Pars. Location: the rocky country around Anshan, north of the Persian Gulf. Family brand: Achaemenid, after a semi-legendary ancestor, Achaemenes. The early family tree runs Tispes, Cyrus I, Cambyses I, names that only serious cuneiform fans used to know, until 559 base, when Cyrus II inherits the Persian throne. He's technically a subject of the Medes. His overlord is Astyages, who rules the plateau from Ecbatana, modern Hamadan, a city Greeks say glitters with 7 colourful walls like a Babylonian mood board. Then the plot accelerates. In 550 bus, Cyrus takes out the boss. Astyages is overthrown. Herodotus, gossip king of the 5th century Bas, supplies the spiciest version. A Median general named Harpagus, whom Astyages allegedly punished by feeding him his own son, leads a defection to Cyrus. The corpse banquet tale works as dark prestige TV, though historians keep it in the maybe, but probably not folder. What matters is this: the Medes collapse. Cyrus walks into Ecbatana, and the Achaemenid toolkit absorbs the Median administrative network. Overnight, a sub-kingdom becomes a continental contender with cavalry, a bureaucratic backbone, and swagger. Next west, Lydia, ruled by Croesus of Sardis, the original richer than Croesus. He commands the gold of the Pactolus River and Lydian mints that pioneered coinage in the 7th century base. He tests his fate at Delphi, gets the classic cryptic oracle line about destroying a great empire if he goes to war. He crosses the Halys River. A campaign follows. Clash at Tetaria in 547 Burs. Winter pause. And then Cyrus sprints through the off-season. He blitzes Sardis, crushes the Lydian cavalry with a low-budget innovation, camels that spook horses, and captures Croesus after a 14-day siege. Lydia falls in 546 Bus, the Ionian Greek cities on the coast. Once Croesus's clients are picked off by Cyrus's general Harpagus, with earthworks and siege tactics, city by city, coast to coast. Anyone who assumed the Persians were just nomads with pretty pants learns the hard way. Then the masterstroke at Babylon in 539 Bes. The political setup is textbook. King Nabonidus is unpopular with some Babylonian priests. He's been off in Tama, in Arabia, leaving his son Belshazzar to run the New Year festival. Babylon's elites simmer. Cyrus positions himself as the liberator chosen by Marduk, the city's chief god, and the Pripe campaign writes itself. The city falls, without a fight, on 12/13, October 539, according to the Babylonian Chronicle. A few weeks earlier, Cyrus fought a brutal battle and likely sacked nearby Opis, with heavy casualties, so the victory isn't exactly bloodless, but inside Babylon the handover is clean. Cyrus enters as king of the world, and friend to the gods. He immediately drops a press release. The famous Cyrus cylinder. It's a real artifact from Babylon, written in Akkadian cuneiform, which can be summarized as the previous management disrespected Marduk. Marduk now picks Cyrus. Cyrus returns displaced gods to their homes. In 538 Bas, this policy includes returning some exiled Judeans to Jerusalem and funding a rebuilt temple. The result is ancient pre-magic. To the Babylonian clergy, he sounds pious. To the Judean scribes, he looks like a messiah. To modern audiences, the cylinder has been marketed as a first human rights charter. That slogan sells museum tickets, but it slaps 21st century frosting on a 6th century Bess royal proclamation. Cyrus didn't abolish slavery. He didn't invent freedom of speech. He did run the most sophisticated pragmatism campaign of the Iron Age. Stabilize after conquest by honoring local gods, legal traditions, and elites. Then tax, conscript, and move on to the next problem. The borders explode outward. In less than 30 years, the Achaemenid Empire runs from the Aegean Sea to Bactria and beyond. Under Darius I, it touches the Indus. It will wind up covering roughly 5.5 million square kilometers and about 44% of the world's population, something like 50 million people in a universe of roughly 110 million. The numbers are ridiculous. The trick is not just conquering, it's managing. The Persians figure out how to scale power without constantly rebooting with terror. They keep kings and elites alive when possible, slide Persian governors on top, and plug the territory into a network of roads, rations, scribes, and audits that would make a corporate compliance officer blush. Cyrus doesn't live forever. Around 530 Bas, he dies campaigning in Central Asia. Herodotus gives the cinematic version. A steppe queen named Tomes of the Massageta defeats his army and drops his head in a skin of blood for poetic justice. Alternate traditions say he died fighting other nomads. What endures is his tomb at Pasargadae, a simple gabled stone structure on a stepped base, inscribed in Greek tradition with a line that reads like ancient minimalism. "O man, I am Cyrus. Who won the kingdom for the Persians? Do not grudge me this little earth that covers my body." Whether or not he actually wrote those words, his successors keep the grave pristine. Alexander the Great will pause there later, like a fan visiting the original franchise creator. His son Cambyses too takes the wheel in 530 BC and heads straight for Africa. In 525 Bas, after Amasis II dies and Psamtik-Deret takes over, Cambyses invades Egypt. The decisive showdown is at Pelusium in the eastern Nile Delta. Herodotus claims the Persians weaponized cats, exploiting Egyptian reverence for the animal. That story reads like an internet meme centuries before the internet. Archaeology doesn't back it. What is documented? A battle at Pelusium, the fall of Memphis, and a Persian victory that folds Egypt with its gold, grain, and shipyards into the empire. Libya and Cyrene send gifts to avoid disaster. Cambyses tries to push south into Nubia and west toward the Siwa oasis. The famous lost army of 50,000 who supposedly vanish in the desert is almost certainly a folk tale. What is certain? Cambyses rules Egypt as pharaoh, with an Egyptian name in inscriptions. He's branded insane by Greek writers for temple-desecrating behavior. That assessment reeks of hostile spin. The administrative documents still run. The tax receipts still add up. Then Persian politics explodes. In 522 Bas, Cambyses dies while returning from Egypt. Greek accounts say by accidentally stabbing himself when his sword slips. Back home, someone claiming to be his brother Bardia Smerdis in Greek, sits on the throne. Darius, a distant relative and high official, claims this Bardia is a fake named Golmata, a magus who seized the crown. In September 522 Bar, Darius and a small group kill the usurper and take power. It's a coup with an origin story carved right into a cliff. Darius's Behistun inscription, a billboard of imperial legitimacy. Picture a sheer rock face near modern Bisotun, Iran, engraving as tall as a multi-story building, with Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform texts, and a relief showing Darius, with a long bow, standing over a fallen foe he calls the Lie. Behind lie other defeated rebels, each labelled with names and provinces. Nidintu Bul, who called himself Nebuchadnezzar III in Babylon, Atrina in Susa, Fravartish in Media, and more. This isn't passive-aggressive. It's aggressive, and it doubles as a multilingual literacy project. Old Persian cuneiform appears here in formal glory, a brand new alphabet of wedges that makes the royal voice portable across stone. A palace can fall, a mountain lasts. Darius I, who rules from 522 to 486 Buff, is the CEO who turns a fast-growing company into a multinational with writable procedures. He divides the empire into satrapies, provinces, often cited as 20 in his system. Herodotus gives this number, though the total fluctuates over time. Each satrapy has a satrap, a governor, but also separate military commanders, and the king's secret auditors, known to Greek writers as the eyes and ears. Its checks and balances with sharp knives to keep provincial bosses loyal. Tribute is standardized and listed with forensic detail. Herodotus, Book 3, rattles off numbers. The Assyrians and Babylonians owe 1,000 talents of silver a year. The Indians, 360 talents of gold dust. The total is 14,560 euboic talents of silver equivalent. A talent is about 30 kilograms. The numbers make anyone's eyes widen. Even if Greek figures are messy, the message holds. This empire eats metal. He adds a monetary system. The gold daric, about 8.4 grams, becomes one of the most trusted coins in the ancient world. The silver siglos, around 5.5 grams, handles everyday transactions. These coins often show a Persian royal archer, bow drawn. Greek mercenaries will nickname the daric the archer, and a lot of Greek politics will bend under the weight of these golden archers. If a city-state needs grain, or a fleet, a satrap with a chest of darics can turn ideology into good behavior fast. He pours money into stone. Susa gets a palace with glazed bricks in peacock colors, and a lion frieze that looks like it could still move. Persepolis rises in Fars beginning around 518 Betch. Not so much a city as an ever-expanding ceremonial platform. The Apadana, the great audience hall, eventually holds 72 columns, each over 20 meters tall, with capitals shaped like bulls and lions. Reliefs on the staircases show delegations from subject peoples, 23 groups in one registry, bringing gifts, Bactrians with camels, Lydians with bowls and textiles, Nubians, Greeks call them Ethiopians, with ivory tusks, Indians with gold dust in cloth bags. The message is subtle and unsubtle at once. Diversity, sure, but all roads lead to the king. At Nakshu Rustam nearby, Darius orders his tomb cut high into the rock, a cross-shaped facade, and a relief showing him praying to Ahura Mazda, with fire altar and winged symbol overhead. Xerxes, Artaxerxes' eyes back, and Darius too will copy the design. Drilled into stone, the Achaemenid visual brand gleams with confidence. He builds those roads everyone quotes. The royal road from Susa to Sardis runs roughly 2,600 kilometers, with 100-plus posting stations. Herodotus counted 111. Carriers switch horses at each station and deliver messages with speed Greeks find borderline supernatural. Herodotus's line becomes a postal service motto 2 millennia later. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Ordinary caravans might take 90 days to cover the Susa-Sardis stretch. Carriers using relays can make the journey in a fraction of that time. The empire becomes a nervous system of dirt and hoofbeats. He experiments with science and water. Darius promotes kanats, underground channels that carry groundwater from mountain aquifers to fields with minimal evaporation in arid Iran. Their survival architecture. He also finishes or reopens the canal between the Nile and the Red Sea, earlier started by Pharaoh Necho II. Stelae in Egyptian hieroglyphs, Elamite and Old Persian near modern Suez, announce that ships can sail from the Nile to the Persian Sea. The canal runs roughly 80 to 100 kilometers along the Wadi Tumila. It's not the modern Suez Canal. It's a working connection that boosts traffic and taxes. It feeds the empire's greatest addiction: logistics. He enlarges the map too. Around 510 Bes, his scout Silax of Carianda explores the Indus, proving a route from the river to the sea. Darius forms the satrapy of Hindush along the lower Indus. Indians send tribute in gold dust. The empire's revenue glitters more than the jewelry in a Lydian vault. To the northwest, he campaigns against steppe peoples across the Danube. The Scythians avoid a pitched battle and fight with distance. Persia plants markers of reach, a bridge of boats across the Danube built by Ionian Greek engineers. Control is never permanent there, but the reach is the point. Trouble brews in Ionia, the Greek cities of the Anatolian coast. In 499 Bucks, a revolt breaks out, led by Aristagoras of Miletus. Athens and Eretria send help. In 498 Bars, rebels burn parts of Sardis, including the lower city. Darius signals eternal memory by ordering a slave, according to Herodotus, to remind him 3 times daily. Master, remember the Athenians. It's likely apocryphal, yet captures a mood. The Ionian revolt collapses by 493 BC after the Persian fleet smashes rebels at Lade, but the Athenians have helped torch the satrapal capital. Darius decides to punish the mainland. In 490 BC, his commanders Datis and Artaphernes land forces near Marathon. Herodotus's numbers are big and arguable. That's standard for him. What happens is that the Athenians and a small Plataean force charge a larger Persian army and win. A story about a messenger sprinting 26 miles to announce victory and then dying on the spot arrives centuries later in literary retellings. The attested run in 490 Bar is Paedepides' marathon times. 7. A 240-kilometer journey to Sparta and back to ask for help before the battle. Marathon becomes a Greek national myth. And in the Persian file cabinet, it becomes an inconvenient tabri labeled later. Darius prepares a second invasion. He dies in 486 Ba. The job falls to Xerxes I, who inherits an Egypt in revolt and a war to the west. He crushes the Egyptian revolt and then, in 480 BC, rolls a superstack of troops and ships toward Greece. The numbers Herodotus throws around for Xerxes' army would make an accountant faint. Modern estimates land somewhere under 200,000 for the land force. Still colossal for the time. He orders a canal dug through the Athos Peninsula to avoid a ship-killing cape that had wrecked an earlier fleet under Mardonius. That canal is real and archaeologically visible, about 2 kilometers long. He orders pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, built from hundreds of ships, lashed with cables made of flax and papyrus, and he crosses into Europe. Greek writers say he whips the sea after a storm destroys an earlier bridge, a story that sums up their sense of Persian hubris. They'll never let it go. Thermopylae in 4-8 is a narrow pass and a pre-event. A small Greek force, led by King Leonidas of Sparta, holds for days, then gets encircled when a local path is revealed. The Spartans and their allies die heroically. Greek poets work the story for centuries, and 21st-century movie producers turn the pathos up to 11. The reality is both inspiring and more complicated. There were far more than 300 at Thermopylae. Thespians, Thebans, and others fought too. The Persians had elite infantry. The so-called Immortals, a 10,000 strong corps, whose name derives from a policy of replacing losses to keep the number constant. They weren't zombies. They were the empire's glamour guard, described by Herodotus as bearing spears with silver or gold pomegranate, finials, fine coats, and wicker shields, with scale armor and the soft tiara caps. Persian infantry favor bows and spears. Their shock troops are cavalry. Their strength is combined arms under a disciplined command, not just numbers. Athens burns. Xerxes takes the city after the Greeks evacuate the population, but the naval battle at Salamis in 480 Barts tilts the war. Athenian-led Greek fleets collide with Persian and Phoenician ships in the narrow straits, where a massive armada can't bring numbers to bear. The Greeks win. Xerxes retreats to Asia, leaving behind a force under Mardonius. In 479 Bers, at Plataea, a Greek coalition smashes Mardonius's army, and, on the same day, according to Greek tradition, Ionian Greeks and their allies defeat Persian naval forces at Mycale, on the coast of Anatolia. The empire loses control of much of the Aegean. Greek writers stamp decline across Persia right there. Reality is obnoxiously different from neat Greek textbooks. The empire still controls Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, Anatolia inland, Iran, Central Asia, and the Indus satrapy. It still fields armies and prints coins. It still runs roads, khanats, and global procurement. It still funds friends. Over the next decades, Persian satraps like Tissaphernes and Pharnabazus bankroll Greek factions with derricks. Spartan success in the Peloponnesian War in 404 Bes arrives on a tide of Persian gold fueling a Spartan fleet. Led by Lysander, the empire wasn't knocked off the board in 479 Bes. It evolved. Back to the Persian timeline. After Xerxes is assassinated in 465 Barch, Artaxerxes I takes over, 424 Barch. His reign sees the Greek world swirl. The Delian League, led by Athens, pounds at Persian positions in the Aegean and in Egypt. An Athenian expedition to Egypt in the 450s ends badly when a 6,000 man force gets pinned on an island in the Nile and destroyed. Athens bleeds. By the late 440s, a settlement known as the Peace of Callias may or may not be concluded. Sources argue its existence. What does exist is a reality. Both sides pause, and the empire consolidates. Administrative life under the Achaemenids runs on scribes and seals. The lingua franca of the bureaucracy is Imperial Aramaic, a West Semitic language written on papyrus and parchment, used from Egypt to Bactria for official letters and ledgers. Old Persian appears mainly in royal inscriptions. Elamite and Babylonian are used for monumental and administrative texts as well. The Persepolis fortification tablets, a treasure trove of clay documents dating around 509–494 BETs, show the machine at work: ration lists, travel authorizations, deliveries of wine, beer and grain to workers, managers, and visiting dignitaries across Fars. The detail makes modern AR systems look basic. The tablets name women supervisors, record rations for their staff, and track babies receiving measured amounts. One grandee, Irdabama, appears as an elite woman running estates with hundreds of laborers, issuing orders across a network that reaches far beyond one valley. The empire's economy is hierarchical and unequal, but it's also systematically documented. It runs on people who know where the barley is, where the donkeys are, and who stamps the clay with which signet. Religion under the Achaemenids is not an imposition festival. The kings invoke Ahura Mazda, the wise lord of Iranian religion, and Darius's inscriptions lay out a creed. Ahura Mazda granted him the kingdom. He supports truth, Arta, and opposes the lie, Droga. These concepts echo Zoroastrian thought, and later tradition makes the Achaemenids Zoroastrian, but practice on the ground is pluralistic. The empire funds temples to Marduk in Babylon. It supports Yahoo worshippers in Judah. It recognizes Egyptian gods in Memphis. No universal creed is forced on the subject peoples. This is less enlightened humanism and more sophisticated empire management. Don't fight every local identity. Co-opt it. The result looks enlightened, and in relative terms, it is. It's also handy for tax season. Clothing, art, and etiquette carry the empire's brand. Greeks notice the trousers, an Iranian staple that horrifies tunic-only traditionalists, and the long-sleeved Candice cloak. Courtiers cover their heads with soft caps and perfume the air. Banners and spears flash silver and gold ornaments. Banquets feature wine, heavy on ceremony. The court runs on rank, with proskynesis, formal obeisance, in varying degrees, which Greeks interpret as humiliating worship, even though it varies from a bow to a kneel depending on status. The Persians see it as protocol. To them, the Greeks look wild. The empire's gardens become famous enough to leave a language fossil. The word paradiser in Old Iranian means a walled enclosure, a carefully planned orchard and pleasure ground. It becomes paradise in later languages. Pasargadae and Persepolis feature garden grids with channels and shade trees, a geometry of water and relief in an often desert climate. Architecture and horticulture double as power statements. That scent of pomegranate blooming in the desert is not accidental. Artaxerxes, 6th, 404, 358 Bes, gets the longest reign. His brother Cyrus the Younger, satrap of Lydia and prince, with ambition, challenges him in 401 Bus. Cyrus hires a massive Greek mercenary force, the 10,000, and marches inland. At Cunaxa on the outskirts of Babylon, the two sides fight. The Greeks win their sector spectacularly. Cyrus dies in the melee charging his brother. The Greek mercenaries then march home through hostile country, memorialized in Xenophon's Anabasis, the ultimate survival travelogue. The march is agony and branding. Greek readers get a new story. Persian armies can stop disciplined hoplites, and Persian court politics are messy enough that Greek soldiers find customers even when they lose. For Persia, the crisis ends with continuity. Artaxerxes II keeps the throne. A big satrapal revolt, 360 Bach, follows later. He survives that too. Persia wields diplomacy against the Greeks as skillfully as it swings swords. In 387, Bes, Artaxerxes II dictates the king's peace, also called the Peace of Antalcidas, to the warring Greek states. It forces Athens, Sparta, and others to accept Persian control over Ionia and to keep the Greek cities independent. No hegemon allowed. Athens loses its hold on the coast. Sparta gets the empire's backing for being obedient. The empire that Greeks portrayed as a spent force controls Greek politics with a letter and a seal. That's power, without a single trireme rowing into the Piraeus. Egypt drifts in and out of the empire during the late 5th and 4th centuries. It breaks free under native dynasties. Artaxerxes III, 358-330 8b eventually reconquers it in 343 b. After crushing a revolt in Sidon with brutal efficiency a few years earlier, he evacuates or executes Sidonian elites, uses Greek mercenaries in his reconquest of Egypt, and makes it stick. The empire tightens again. The imperial center holds until a storm hits from the west. Darius, 330 Bath, arrives on the throne with a resume of survival. He inherits a realm with disturbance, powerful satraps, restive peripheries, and then in 334 BC, an 22-year-old Macedonian king named Alexander crosses the Hellespont. Persian and Greek histories collide yet again. At Granicus, 334 Bes, Issus, 333 Bes, and Gaugamela, 331 Bes. The Macedonian army under Alexander outmaneuvers and routs larger Persian forces. Numbers are debated, but the pattern is clear. At Issus, Darius's family is captured. At Gaugamela, Alexander refuses night attacks and still wins on open ground, neutralizing scythe chariots and cracking the Persian left, then punching at the center. Darius flees, trying to regroup in the east. He is assassinated in 330 BC by his own satrap Bessus, who claims the throne as Artaxerxes V in Bactria. Alexander chases him down, executes the pretender, and claims rightful succession. The Achaemenid line ends, murdered not by a Greek spear, but by internal collapse under external pressure. Alexander performs the same imperial ritual as every conqueror in these lands. He crowns himself heir and visits the tomb of Cyrus at Pasargadae with something close to awe. O Empire, thou art mortal. Also, very copyable. Persepolis burns in 330 bars. Set alight after a drunken party, according to one tradition, instigated by the courtesan Thais, egging on Alexander, with other versions presenting a deliberate political act to brand Pan-Hellenic revenge. The debate is, ancient and modern, what remains is blackened stone and toppled columns and thousands of clay tablets baked into immortality by fire, the fortification and treasury archives. The blaze destroys a ceremonial capital that had taken decades of wealth and genius to assemble. It also inadvertently preserves the paperwork that proves how it ran. The Achaemenid legacy hides in plain sight. Concepts like centrally managed provinces, standardized coinage, multilingual governance, empire-scale roads, and a mercifully non-deity complex about other people's gods. All of these survive in successor states. The Seleucids take the administrative skeleton, the Parthians then the Sasanians. We discover the taste for rock-cut royal relief and the title King of Kings. The Roman Empire watches and learns, adopting roads, postal relays, a system of provinces, and a philosophy that local elites co-opted are more reliable than pitched roofs full of resentful peasants. Jewish texts call Cyrus the Lord's anointed. Isaiah 45:1. Greek political history zigzags under Persian influence for a century after Marathon. Even the word paradise is Persian. The myth-busting roll call is worth a blink and recalibrate moment. The Cyrus Cylinder is not a human rights charter in the modern sense. It's merciful kingship as advertised by the king. The Persians weren't a monolithic Zoroastrian theocracy. They supported temples across many religions while promoting their own divine order. The immortals died just fine. Their unit maintained a constant roster by replacing casualties. The Greek wars did not end the Persian Empire. The empire writes Greek peace terms in 380, 387. Cambyses probably didn't go mad and stab the Apis bull for fun. Egyptian records suggest the bull died of disease and was buried with honors. The story about cats at Pelusium makes for viral posts and remains unverified noise. The lost army of 50,000 swallowed by the desert looks like a storytelling fossil, not a data point. Athenian democracy didn't defeat Oriental despotism and retire the empire. It needed Persian cash to topple Sparta later and had to sign on the imperial dotted line when the king said so. Yet the romance is real, and it's earned. The empire built by Cyrus, retooled by Darius, most famous because of Xerxes' bad prayer in Greek theatre, becomes the first experiment in making diversity a management principle rather than a crime. It isn't egalitarian. It is practical and resilient. It uses Aramaic to write orders thousands of kilometers away. And those orders arrive because there's a road station with fresh horses every 25-30 kilometers. It taxes in carefully weighted talents and pays in stamped gold that Greek mercenaries trust more than their local politicians. It puts delegations of Cushites, Lydians, Cappadocians, Indians, and Elamites side by side on a stone staircase, each carved with loving detail down to hats and hair, and says in visual grammar, "There is room under this canopy, as long as everyone remembers who holds the canopy." That scale builds a civilization that handles water like a science. Kalat's Iran and spread into Central Asia and beyond, becoming a technology passed down for 2,500 years. The empire picks port cities and invests in shipbuilding, not just for war, but for trade. Sidon and Tyre make Persian triremes. Egyptian shipyards supply timber and labor. Grain flows from Egypt to feed garrisons far away. Assyria taught the Near East how to terrify. Persia teaches it how to integrate. Even the smallest stylistic choices ripple. The Achaemenids cultivate a court culture where measured aesthetic matters. Those royal columns that become icons at Persepolis, bell, shaped bases, fluted shafts, and massive animal-headed capitals feed into later Iranian design, and even millennia later into revival styles. Gold and silver writer, drinking horns with animal heads, travel to Greek treasuries as loot and inspiration. The Darix archer, bow drawn, shows up on coins widely. The act of creating an alphabetic cuneiform that can write I, Darius, Great King, in crisp old Persian is a pre-gamble that pays off because it helps construct an imperial identity visible on every mountain that faces a road. Government mechanics get nerdy, and the nerdiness is the point. Satraps can't mint gold. Only the king can. Some satraps mint silver for local use, stamped with their symbols to pay troops on campaign, a compromise between central control and frontier needs. Inspectors ride circuits, showing up unannounced, reading ledgers in Aramaic, checking seals. Control of weights and measures is fanatical. That's how the Darrick becomes trusted. Same gold, same stamp, same weight everywhere. An imperial mint at Sardis makes coins with Lydian precision. The word goes out across Aramaic letters. The coin arrives across the royal road. That's not tyranny. That's business. Persian military strength shows up as more than numbers. Combined arms matter. Cavalry archers soften. Spear and shield infantry hold. Elite spearmen guard the king. Heavy cavalry acquires punch over time. And chariots, especially scythe chariots, play the intimidation game where terrain allows. Early Achaemenids used chariots sparingly in the west. At Gargamella, Darius III deploys scythed chariots, and the Macedonians show how a disciplined phalanx can handle them. The motherlode of Persian strength, always, is cavalry and mobility across big spaces. This is an empire that, at one point, coordinates garrisons from Egypt to Bactria with messages written in one language and delivered on horses raised in another, overseen by nobles whose ancestors herded on the plateau. That's cohesive scale. The Greek sources provide drama and bias in equal measure. Herodotus, 440b is the essential gossip with footnotes. And he often says, "So they say," a humble disclaimer modern readers forget. Ctesias, a Greek doctor at the Persian court, writes a history that is a Schatzkammer of tall tales. Xenophon writes both the Anabasis and the Cyropedia, the latter a fictionalized ideal portrait of Cyrus, serving as a mirror for Greek political philosophy more than a biography. The next generation of modern history reading brought the world the Persepolis tablets and Behiston. Those documents, plus Babylonian records, changed the tone. When Darius writes in 3 languages that he fought 11 rebels in 19 battles across 2 years, and then archaeologists find the names he lists on separate local tablets, that isn't legend, that's receipts. It's also messy. The empire acts violently when necessary. Babylon's rebellion under Xerxes in 480 2b is crushed with force. Sources suggest city walls get damaged, elites punished, deportations enacted. In Sidon around 351 backs, the rebellion is put down by Artaxerxes III with atrocities. The city burns, thousands die. The Achaemenids are not teddy bears. They are empire masters, operating in an Iron Age settings, where mercy is policy, but terror remains a tool. The difference is in dosage. They don't use terror as the brand, they use administration. And then there are the images that never quit. Ecbatana's polychrome walls, Susa's lion frieze with glaze shimmering like a silk coat. The Apadana's tribute bearers, each with their textures of hair, their folds of cloth, their animals true to species. The staircase to Xerxes' palace, where bas-reliefs show royal guards with curly beards and stylized locks, carved with a style so consistent that modern art historians can detect the hands of specific workshops. The tombs at Nakshi Rustam, Darius's, Xerxes's, Artaxerxes was, Darius's tombs, like stone crosses hung on the cliff, each with a platform where the king stands, before the fire altar, the winged symbol overhead, and the subject peoples holding up the platform in carved ranks. Visual theology with a project manager's eye. As the Achaemenid world falls to Alexander, the memory does not vanish. The Seleucids copy the chancery practice. The Parthians, then Sasanians, lean into the title Shahanshah, King of Kings, and adopt Achaemenid spaces as their sacred geography. The Hebrews move through Persian support to rebuild a temple that becomes a new center of life. The Greeks build tragedies, Aeschylus's Persians, where Xerxes is a grieving, chastened figure, and the empire's size becomes a metaphor for hubris and fragility. The modern world digs up the cylinder, the Behistun inscriptions, and the Persepolis tablets and discovers a different story. Something more complicated than despotism bad, freedom good. It's a managerial masterpiece with rough edges, sharper than a median sword. Even the small stuff echoes. The motto for the US Postal Service echoes Herodotus on Persian couriers. The word paradise carries the memory of shade trees planted by Achaemenid gardeners 2.5 millennia ago. Diplomatic words like satrap slip into modern languages as metaphors for regional bosses. The challenge to central administration, trust but verify, reads like a Darius memo. The concept of granting local autonomy within an imperial framework becomes a playbook used by empires from Rome to the Ottomans to the British Raj. And for anyone raised on the Greek end of the story, one final recalibration lands with a thud. In 387, 386th Beth, the Persian king's peace dictates the terms of Greek interstate behavior. A barbarian monarch in Greek stereotype sets the rules for the self-proclaimed free world. The Achaemenid rule ends under Alexander, not because it was a dinosaur as such, but because the Macedonians combined Persian cavalry speed with Greek heavy infantry discipline. A fusion the Persians themselves were on the road to understanding, but hadn't institutionalized. When it fails fast, as big systems often do. The administrative skeleton remains in place long enough for Alexander to step into it and run Asia by borrowing the Persian satrapal map and the Persian postal system. This rise from a hill tribe to a 5.5. behemoth takes barely a century. Cyrus picks the lock. Cambyses kicks in the Egyptian door. Darius builds walls of spreadsheets and stone. Xerxes loses a naval war, but not the empire. Later, kings fight, buy, and bluff their way through a volatile Mediterranean. It takes Alexander to bring a state that big to a close, and even he does it by wearing Persian clothes, sitting on Persian thrones, and marrying into Persian lines. The Achaemenid Empire doesn't vanish. It becomes the standard by which empire in Afro-Eurasia gets defined for centuries. There is a last image worth holding. A relay rider on the royal road leaving Susa at dusk, a sealed letter in Aramaic in his satchel, galloping through dawns and dust to Sardis, where a Lydian mint will stamp gold with an archer. That coin may end up in a Spartan pay chest that sinks an Athenian trireme. That letter may tell a satrap in Lydia to audit a tax farm. The system moves. It's the quiet hum of power, not the roar of a charge. The rise of the Persian Empire isn't just conquest. It's the invention of scale. And long after Alexander's soldiers torch Persepolis, that scale still shapes how states imagine themselves and how roads carry more than people. It carries policy, promise, and the belief that an empire built on many voices can hold, if the center can listen and the couriers can ride. Sources shadow the story, like the couriers shadow the road. The Babylonian chronicles, especially the Nabonidus Chronicle, pin down dates, 539 BC for Babylon's fall. Without drama, the Cyrus cylinder gives the pre-version of benevolent conquest. The Behistun inscription provides Darius's self-defense and the roster of rebellions he crushed between 522 and 520 B. Herodotus's histories, books 1-9, and Aeschylus's Persians feed the Greek view with style and myth baked in. The Persepolis fortification and treasury tablets, tens of thousands of clay documents, reveal the rations, movements, administrations, and human networks behind the stone. Xenophon's Anabasis captures the empire's eastern heartlands through Greek eyes on foot. Archaeology, the Athos Canal, Susa's glazed bricks, the Royal Road staging posts, where they've been identified, and tombs at Naqsh Rustam anchors the glamour in stone and dirt. Cross-checking those sources filters gossip from policy, gives camels instead of chariots, where chariots don't fit, and leaves a story with edge and proof. In the end, the rise of the Persian Empire looks like a magic trick, pulling a continental bureaucracy out of a nomad hat. But the trick turns out to be work. Roads, letters, weights, watches, warehouses, rations, and a lot of clay tablets baked by accident. The style is magnificent. The substance is management. The Greeks told the world the Persians were decadent. The clay says otherwise. The Achaemenids didn't just rule. They operationalized the idea of a multicultural state. And while every empire breaks, the Persian version leaves behind a template, so appealing that even its conqueror copies its stationery, keeps its satraps, and bows quietly to its founder's tomb. Our journey through history continues with the influence of the Hittite Empire on ancient Anatolia. History keeps receipts, but sometimes it misfiles them for 3,000 years. The Hittite Empire built an international power stretching from the Aegean coast to the upper Euphrates, wrote the world's earliest surviving peace treaty, ran a multilingual bureaucracy that would make a modern civil service sweat, and then evaporated from collective memory so completely that 19th century scholars treated them like a biblical cameo rather than a superpower. Anatolia did not simply host the Hittites. Anatolia was rearranged, standardized, litigated, fortified, and spiritually remixed by them. The influence is everywhere. In law codes copied and tweaked across towns, in roads and relay stations, connecting mountains and plains, in rock sanctuaries where 1,000 gods marched in silent stone, and in the archives, 30,000 clay tablet fragments dug from Hattusa, where it all still whispers. Start with the reintroduction. In 1834, the French explorer Charles Texier rode into the central Anatolian plateau and stared at cyclopean walls, lion-flanked gates, and broken reliefs at a site locals called Boazkir. He did not know that this was Hattusa, the Hittite capital, and that he was standing on top of Bronze Age spreadsheets the size of a village. Fast forward to 1906. German archaeologist Hugo Winkler began formal excavations, and the ground delivered archives in cuneiform by the crate. In 1915, a Czech linguist named Bedřich Hrozný pulled the language out of silence with an iconic line, Nu ninda nezatani waterma, akutani, translated as, now bread you will eat, and water you will drink. The line turned Hittite into the earliest attested Indo-European language. And suddenly, those silent stones had a voice again. Anatolia's late Bronze Age had a narrator. The narrator had receipts. Rewind, though, because Hittite influence begins before the empire. Long before great kings stamped seals, Anatolia swarmed with trading colonies run by old Assyrian merchants. Around 1950-1750 Bes, the Karen system, centered at Kultepe, ancient Kanesh, near modern Kayseri, moved tin and textiles like a well-oiled logistics network. Over 20,000 clay tablets from Kultepe detail consignment lists, debts, taxes, and legal disputes. That network is the economic skeleton the Hittites later muscled up. Assyrian merchants brought cuneiform literacy and standardized accounting. Hittite rulers later adopted the script and bureaucratic habits then scaled them empire-wide. Because of that import, even village quarrels in central Anatolia ended up in a clay filing cabinet. Nothing says influence like domestic drama, immortalized in cuneiform. The early Hittite kings, Hattusili and his successor Mursili, did not wait for anyone's permission. Around 65 to 66 to 600 Besh, Hattusili centralized power from the hill fort of Hattusa, which sits at about 500 meters elevation in the bend of the Halis River, modern Kizilirmak, in northern Mesopotamia. Then Mursili capped the audacity with a long-range strike. Around 1595 Bats, a Hittite army swept down and sacked Babylon, ending Hammurabi's dynasty. No permanent occupation followed, but the message to Anatolia was loud. A king from the Central Plateau could project force over 1,000 kilometers, and he did not need coastal ports to do it. The knock-on effect inside Anatolia was simple. Local rulers learned that political gravity had shifted to Hattusa. Tribute, loyalty, or trouble. Those were the options. Hittite law made the new order feel less like improvisation and more like policy. The Hittite law code, compiled across centuries, reads like a legal engineer's attempt to keep society from tearing itself apart. Compared to the eye for an eye ferocity of some Babylonian penalties, Hittite law favors fines, compensations, and negotiated outcomes. Theft of a sheep could bring fines in silver. Wounding a free person meant a formula-based payout for the injury, lost labor and prestige damage. Certain offenses, rape, treason, bestiality, still earned execution, so nobody gets the idea this was a Bronze Age utopia. But overall, the tone is managerial, not theatrical. That mentality soaked into Anatolia. As Hittite influence spread, so did their legal language, their scribal forms, and their habit of writing the boring stuff down. Anatolian states did boring on clay tablets because the Hittites made bureaucracy the norm. The empire's real power move was a vassal system, backed by roads, messengers, and regular oversight. Anatolia had always been a mosaic. Luwians in the west, Hattic speakers around Hattusa, Palak up north, Hurrian influence sliding in from the southeast. The Hittites did not erase that mosaic. They laminated it. Vassal kings in Arzawa, Mira, the Seha Riverland, Hapala and Walusa, possibly the Troy of later Greek epics, swore oaths to the Hittite great king. Those oaths were not just threats and barked orders. They were contracts with clauses about tribute, troops on demand, extradition of fugitives, and lines of succession approved by the overlord. The documents warned vassals not to flirt with other great kings. When Hittite letters talk about Ahiawa, they are referencing a Mycenaean Greek power sphere across the Aegean, and in some late letters the Hittite great king even acknowledges the Hittite great king, even acknowledges the Hayawa ruler as a peer. That is the Bronze Age version of recognizing a rival superpower across the water. Anatolia's west learned to speak treaty. Hittite forms shaped the diplomatic grammar from the Meander Valley to the Tahantasa Plain. Now the myth correction that refuses to die gets escorted out of the building. The Hittites did not invent ironworking for mass production, and they did not march across Anatolia in iron mail while everyone else fiddled with bronze. Iron objects existed as far back as the 3rd millennium BOSS, often from meteoritic iron, and the Hittites used iron sparingly for prestige items. Widespread iron tools and weapons exploded only after 1200 BC, and not because a Hittite factory posted a how-to thread. What the Hittites actually did was run a fully tuned bronze economy and leave scattered evidence of skilled iron use that later audiences overhyped. The empire's influence on metallurgy is real, but it looks like supply chains and regulation rather than a superhero origin story. Tin for bronze moved through networks the Hittites monitored and taxed. The recipients across Anatolia understood that metal was power, and that Hattusa kept score. Their military system is where influence turns cinematic. Chariot warfare dominated late Bronze Age battlefields, and the Hittites leaned into that with a training science that would impress a modern athletic coach. The Kikuli text, a horse training manual from around the 15th-14th century B, describes a detailed conditioning program over months, traditionally described as about 2 14 days, using interval work, rest cycles, and graded feeds. It even counts laps and prescribes water breaks. Step aside. Luxury gym memberships. The Hittites were doing data-driven conditioning when the Olympic gods were just myths in the making. This matters for Anatolia because chariot teams were expensive. They required pasture land, fodder, logistics, and specialized personnel. Any vassal in Anatolia wanting to survive under Hittite oversight had to align local economies to support that machine. Provinces became supply chains. That is influence. The Battle of Kadesh is the blockbuster proof of concept. In 1274 Bes, the Hittites under Muwatalli II met Ramesses II on the Orontes River in Syria. The Egyptian inscriptions inflate numbers like a political campaign ad, but the bones are clear. The Hittites fielded heavy 3-man chariots built to smash into enemy formations. The Egyptians relied on faster 2-man vehicles for maneuver and archery. Both sides claimed victory across stone walls and carved reliefs. The stalemate mattered more than the bragging. The long-term result was an unprecedented treaty in year 21 of Ramesses Tay, around 1259 Bes. A Hittite-Egyptian peace pact. 2 versions survive, one from the Egyptian side carved at Karnak, and the other from the Hittite side, preserved on clay from Hattusa, both in Akkadian diplomatic language. The treaty includes non-aggression, mutual defense, and extradition of fugitives, with divine witness lists, long enough to make a pantheon blush. That legal instrument became Anatolian soft power. Towns and regions learned that stability had paperwork, that war could end in clauses, and that the Hittite way of formalizing politics could reach into the daily lives of borderland shepherds. If anyone wants to see the Hittite taste for maximum theater in stone rather than text, the gates of Hattusa deliver. The Lion Gate, the King's Gate, the Sphinx Gate at the Yerkapo Rampart. These are the Instagram angles of the late Bronze Age. The city walls snaked for several kilometers, likely over 6, bolstered by casemate construction and monumental ramparts. There is even a corbelled tunnel under one rampart known as a Persian, like an underground shortcut in a war game. The great temple in the lower city sprawled across roughly 165 by 145 meters, a complex dedicated to the storm god of Hatti and the sun goddess of Arina. The storage rooms in that temple made the building practically a warehouse of offerings and grain, proof that piety and logistics climbed the same stairs. Anatolia's central plateau bristled with Hittite fortifications and temple granary hybrids, a built environment that told every visitor that power camped here. The architecture radiated an idea. This is a state with a hammer in one hand and an archive stamp in the other. Religion in the Hittite world did not unify. It federated. Ever heard the land of 1,000 gods applied to Hatti? That is not a poetic flourish. The Hittites were enthusiastic religious collectors. They absorbed local deities, particularly from the Luwian and Herian worlds, and slotted them into elaborate cult calendars. The storm god Teshub from the Hurrians got cozy with the sun goddess of Arina. Shashka, the Hurrian version of Ishtar, strolled right into Hittite rituals. Hebet smiled out from Syrian cities now under Hittite administration. Queen Pudu Hepa, a powerhouse in the early 13th century BC and wife of Hattusili III, reorganized cults, standardized priestly personnel, and sent letters to foreign courts with her own seal. Her prayer texts mix theology with politics, which is Bronze Age normal. Yazilakaya, the rock sanctuary near Hattusa, stages the pantheon in a carved procession that still stops visitors cold. Some researchers argue for a calendrical or astronomical function in the relief arrangement, possibly mapping festivals to lunar months, though that interpretation remains debated. Whether calendar or cosmic roll call, the message across Anatolia was unmistakable. Local gods kept their names, but the Hittite court arranged the seating chart. The people running this pantheon bureaucracy combo were not shy about relocating themselves either. When Kaska tribes hammered the northern frontier and other crises stacked up, the Hittite court temporarily operated from Samuha on the Kislemak. Later, Muwat Ali C did something even bolder. He shifted the capital to Tarhuntasa in southern Anatolia to deal with the Syrian front more efficiently. Hattusili III relocated the capital back to Hattusa. Afterward, capital moves change maps and economies. When the court shifted south, so did demands for grain, animal herds, and skilled labor. Anatolia's interior felt the tug every time palace geography changed. Nobles, scribes, and craft specialists followed the center like planets orbiting a star that sometimes ventured to a new constellation. Every vassal system relies on messengers, and the Hittites made running official messages an art. They kept way stations and official posts along major routes that stitched together Anatolia's variable terrain. Mountains, river bends, high plateaus. None of it prevented orders from catching up with a reluctant governor. The cuneiform tablets grumble about late deliveries, missing caravan guards, and absent officials, and those complaints are exactly how a region learns to expect central pressure. A messenger culture does more than carry news. It creates a shared timeline. Provinces far from Hattusa lived on the same administrative calendar as the capital, a subtle but powerful force that aligned harvests, troop levies, and festival circuits. Western Anatolia's story is a case study in Hittite influence, as negotiation and pressure rather than blunt colonization. The Ozawa lands, Mira Seher Riverland, Apala, moved between rebellion and compliance for decades. A famous rock relief at Karabel, near modern Izmir, shows a local king named Tarkasnawa of Mira in hieroglyphic Luwian, and that name appears in Hittite texts. The cross-reference cemented the geography. Wilusa, likely Troy, shows up in the so-called Tawabalawa letter, where Hattusili III addresses an Ahiawa ruler about ties, grievances, and regional disputes. The Milawata letter mentions Milawata, almost certainly Miletus, and its shifting loyalties. Western towns learned that the Hittite state had both the patience for letters and the will for campaigns. The result was a Western Anatolia that spoke Luwian at home, Akkadian in diplomacy, and Hittite when the tax collector arrived. Cultural bilingualism is influenced with receipts and a stationary budget. Hittite administration pushed standardization without flattening diversity. The empire used multiple languages in tablets, Hittite for internal matters, Akkadian for international diplomacy, Hurrian for rituals, and Sumerian logograms sprinkled like clerical confetti inside Hittite sentences. Luwian appeared in two scripts, cuneiform Luwian, recorded on clay, and the hieroglyphic Luwian system carved on stone in public inscriptions. That last one would outlive the empire in the Neo-Hittite principalities of the early Iron Age. In places like Karchemish, Malatya, Malid, Kumur, Commagene, Tabal, and Kay, rulers carved their boasts in hieroglyphic Luwian, while their neighbors copied texts in Phoenician. The Karatati bilingual inscription from the late 8th century Bas written in Phoenician and Luwian hieroglyphs, proved crucial for decipherment. Anatolia's early Iron Age script politics looked like a shared legacy of Hittite multilingual logistics. Even after the capital fell, the writing habits stayed. To understand the Hittites' day-to-day shaping of Anatolia, peek into their archives beyond the grand treaties. The Annals of Merzili II read like a ruler's diary of stress management, campaigns against the Kaska, reports of famines, prayers during a plague that dragged on for years after Sapiliuma. I brought Egyptian captives home from campaigns in Syria. Those plague prayers record a guilt-ridden theory of cosmic cause and effect. A guilty king seeks divine forgiveness for political sins and personal failures, and in the process leaves notes about food supplies, local revolts, and the locations of temples. The Telepinu Edict, from a king around 1525-1500 BC, recaps the royal family's messy habit of assassinations and coups in brutal detail, then sets rules for succession designed to calm the family down. Anatolia watched a great king legislate his own house, admit to disaster, and use law to tie up the knives. The entire region took the hint. Internal order starts with rules that everyone pretends to respect, even when they do not. The empire's cultural economy carried a shared diet too. The tablets track rations of bread, ninda and beer, portions of meat and animal sacrifices for festivals. There are instructions for grinding grain, measurements for barley allocations, and shipping lists for oil jars. The details are small, but the total is enormous. Hittite Anatolia synchronized its hunger. When the great temple stockpiled grain in Hattusa, it made sure the gods had offerings for the An, Tarshum festival, and the Puruli spring rites, and that local temples across the provinces ran on the same circuit. Priesthoods moved across towns, processions crossed boundaries, farmers timed sowing and reaping to the same official calendar. Influence here smells like baked bread and incense and stable straw. The Hittites also did infrastructure better than their brand reputation admits. Water is the constant obsession across central Anatolia's dry summers and capricious rains. Archaeology has documented Hittite waterworks, including a dam near Alakahuyuk known as Gulpanar, widely dated to the 13th century B under Tudhali Aiv, based on inscriptions and associated remains. The dam gathered spring water for irrigation and rituals, complete with stone channels and basins. Turul hilltops might have seen water redirected into sacred pools like those at Iflatun Punar in the Konya Plain, built with Hittite-style relief blocks, even if the exact dates of some features remain debated. This is not a scatter of wells. It is a cultural commitment to controlling water in a highland environment, sown into the landscape between fields and sanctuaries. When Anatolia thinks about water management in the Late Bronze Age, it is thinking with Hittite tools. Art and iconography broadcast that influence without subtitling. Storm gods stand with thunderbolts. Kings clasp deities' hands in scenes of ritual legitimacy. Sphinxes and lions guard portals into cities like mid-Bronze Age bouncers. The Sudberg relief at Hattusa shows the weather god, the king, and a procession of divine attendants coming down a mountain slope, a stone storyboard about power descending to earth. At Yizalikaya, the long file of male deities, led by the storm god, meets a parallel line of goddesses led by Hebat. The pairs converge on the ruling divine couple. This is ideology in rock, and it spreads because stone lasts longer than speeches. When later Phrygian and Lydian sculptors put storm gods on mountain thrones or carved procession scenes, they were not copying line by line, but the grammar felt familiar. Anatolia's visual language carried Hittite syntax. If Hattusa is the archive, Karchemish is the satellite office that survived into the Iron Age with some swagger. The Hittites set up a viceroyalty of Karchemish in northern Syria, often staffed by a royal prince. Even after the Central Empire collapsed, Carchemish remained a major city for centuries, issuing inscriptions in hieroglyphic Luwian and negotiating with Arameans, Assyrians, and anyone else who mattered. That continuity fed back into southern Anatolia. When Assyria, under Shalmaneser III, or Tiglath-Pileser III, rolled west in the 9th, 8th centuries B, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms presented themselves as heirs of a Hittite order, keeping the old ritual forms while updating the costume. Anatolia's Iron Age was not a reset, it was a remix. The fall of the empire packs a dramatic punch because it is rapid enough to be cinematic and messy enough to be real. After the high tide under Suppiluliuma I and Mursili II, the empire struggled under Mu'tali II, Hattusili III, and Tudali IV with internal disputes, famines, and grinding frontier war. Climate data adds a hard edge. A 2020 study, led by Sturt Manning, analyzed tree rings from juniper timbers in central Anatolia and flagged an unusually severe drought window around 1196 bus. It is not a silver bullet, because societies do not collapse from weather alone, but it is a brutal multiplier. Short harvests squeeze vassals, delay deliveries, and provoke revolts. Add Casca raids from the north, sea peoples, marauders shifting trade along the coasts, and a possible breakdown of the palace redistribution system, and the Hittite center in Hattusa burned out around 1190 B. Excavations show destruction layers and abandonment. The empire's administrative heart stopped beating, and Anatolia's map dissolved into regional polities. Even in collapse, Hittite influence structured what came next. The western and central highlands saw movements and reconfigurations that would later produce the Phrygians. Eastern Anatolia pulled into Urshun orbit by the 9th century Bas. Southern Anatolia and northern Syria ran on Neo-Hittite cultural currency. As already noted, literacy habits persisted. Luwian hieroglyphs remained a prestige script for monumental statements until Assyrian expansions and Aramaic usage shifted the linguistic landscape. Legal habits survived. 2. Land grants with formulaic descriptions of fields, pastures, vines, and spring rites show continuity in property conception. Religious iconography, the storm god, mountain gods, sacred trees, did not vanish. Hittite cultural gravity kept tugging long after the central mass was gone. The Hittites also left Anatolia with a network memory of how to handle big neighbors. The art of triangulation between Egypt, Assyria, Mitanni, and local powers may sound like ancient history, but it built a political reflex that Anatolian states would use again in later centuries when facing Assyria, Lydia, Persia, and eventually Macedon. That is part of influence. Less a law code and more a muscle memory. Anatolia learned to flatter, stall, swap hostages, send princesses, and use geography as a bargaining chip. The Hittites did not invent that game, but they played it with a scale and a paper trail that trained their neighbors. There is also the language gift that cannot be overstated. Hittites' Indo-European status reset how scholars think about the ancient world's linguistic map. Terms like Panku for assembly or Labana for the great king rolled into studies that compare Indo-European political language across time. The earliest recorded Indo-European sentences live on Anatolian soil, not on Greek or Latin vellum. The fact that the Hittite language was written in cuneiform, adapted from Mesopotamia, adds another layer. Anatolia became the place where traditions cross-pollinated. Mesopotamian scripts, Indo-European grammar, Hurrian rituals, Luwian hieroglyphs. That hybridity is not a footnote. It is the operating system of central and western Anatolia for centuries. The modern rediscovery storyline shook up the narrative of ancient Near Eastern history and, by extension, the image of Anatolia. After Winkler's finds at Hattusa, the Boaz Koué excavations continued under German and Turkish teams, uncovering tablets by the tens of thousands. Over 30,000 tablet fragments are commonly cited, covering royal annals, treaties, letters, myths, and administrative records. The archives yielded versions of Mesopotamian stories, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, adapted into Hittite, along with native myths like the Iluyanka dragon tale. That myth tells of the storm god defeating a serpent with the help of a human, with themes of lost and regained power. It is tempting to draw lines from that to later Anatolian and Greek myth, although direct influences are complex. What matters for influence is that Hittite scribes participated in an international literary culture while producing heavily localized narratives. Anatolia's imagination absorbed Babylonian stories and then returned them with Hittite inflections, much as later Anatolians would absorb and adapt Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman materials. The stream of modern discoveries adds a few plot twists worth savoring. One of the sphinxes from Hattusa's Sphinx Gate ended up in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. After the early digs, in 2011, after years of negotiation and conservation work, Germany returned it to Turkey. The legal dance around a single stone guardian mirrors the ancient Hittite obsession with seals and ownership. Even a sphinx got stuck in a treaty drama where borders and rights mattered. Anatolia's west has another reveal. The Wilusa-Troy identification moved from bold hypothesis to mainstream acceptance through a decade-spanning confluence of texts and archaeology. The link between the Hittite Wilusa and Greek Ilion is now widely supported by the geography of the Troad, the identification of the Seher River land with the Bakir Say Valley, and the Karabal inscription nailing Mira's location. The Manapa Hunta letter, a scrappy tablet, mentions a seer named Madiwata and an incident in Wilusa tied to Hittite politics. No wooden horse pops out of a tablet, but the conclusion is solid enough to redraw cultural maps. Hittite files contain lines that touch Homeric landscapes. Anatolia's west sits in the middle of a Hittite-Mycenaean conversation, with the Hittites writing most of the minutes. Zoom back inside the empire's mechanics for a moment, because the personnel workbook is quietly influential. Provincial governors, palace officials, scribes, and temple staff come with titles that tell their own story. Hazanu for a local mayor, Gal Mesidi for the royal bodyguard commander, Dumu, Lugal, the royal son, serving as viceroy in crucial satellites like Karchemish. These people moved across Anatolia. A scribe trained in Hattusa could serve in a western vassal capital. An artisan from central Anatolia might carve a relief in a Luwian-speaking town, using a repertoire learned at the core. Hittite influence radiated with the people who carried it. Over time, their children married local families, and the empire's styles became regional traditions. Culture wins by repetition and marriage arrangements. Hittite law's calmer tone compared to Babylonian severity created a cultural message that sticks. The state prefers order to spectacle. The edicts and decrees also reveal a concern for farmland boundaries, irrigation rights, and the duties of field guards. Anatolia's steppe and plateau require constant negotiation between pastoralists and farmers. Hittite texts bring that friction into legal consciousness. Who grazes where, who repairs a canal, who pays when a boundary stone shifts. A later Anatolian under Phrygian or Lydian kings inherits that habit of thinking the land through legal frames. Property is not just possession. It is description, witness lists, and an expectation that the state can be appealed to about it. There are limits worth acknowledging, because influence is not a fairy tale. The Hittite center often struggled to keep the north under control. The Casca never formed a single kingdom, but their ongoing raids were the empire's sore tooth. Casca pressure pulled resources and attention away from other frontiers and forced the court to consider moving capitals. That reality shaped Anatolia too. Northern highlands developed in tension with the lowland administrative heart. Peripheral communities learned how to raid into official systems and then withdraw into terrain that bureaucrats could not easily patrol. The empire's failure to fully incorporate the north tells as much about Anatolia's stubborn landscapes as the walls of Hattusa do. Chronology is another quiet engine of influence. Hittite historians and modern scholars divide the empire into Old, Middle, and New Kingdom phases. With the New Kingdom 1400 to 1200 BC being the era of global swagger. Sapaliulema, I rebuilt power in Syria. Mercili Deceive stabilized the core and fought on multiple fronts. Mu'tali II fought Egypt at Kadesh. Hattusili III signed peace with Ramesses II. And Tudhaliaev built dams, reorganized cults, and carved his kingdom into stone. Each of those phases left different fingerprints on Anatolia. The Old Kingdom made Hattusa a capital and spread Hittite law. The Middle Kingdom shrank and regrouped, solidifying the idea of a core territory called the Lower Land and Upper Land, terms that would make sense to Anatolian administrators long afterward. The empire period pushed Hittite habits into western coastal valleys and down into northern Syria. That layered influence is why the Iron Age features different Hittite echoes in different places. It depends on which phase smacked a region the hardest. Ask any Hittite scribe what mattered about a king, and a long list of gods would show up as witnesses, because oath culture drove the whole thing. Vassal oaths, military oaths, oaths of loyalty, sworn over cut animals and poured libations. These were the glue. Anatolia learned that loyalty had a ritual grammar. Anyone who broke an oath called down a long roster of divine punishments on themselves, their families, and their fields. That fear is a cultural export. It shows up later in how Anatolian kings, even outside Hittite lines, talk about treason and fidelity. Oath texts made morality an administrative category. Trade and tribute knit Anatolia into a redistribution machine. Provinces delivered grain, timber, metals, stone blocks, horses, and textiles into the royal system. And the royal system redistributed feasts, wages, and prestige goods. Timber from the Pontic Mountains, limestone from local quarries, copper and silver from Anatolian ores. Materials took routes that Hittite governors could grade on compliance. The reality on the ground was often messy, with shortfalls, theft, and delays. The habit of recording all that messiness taught Anatolian elites to think of themselves as nodes in a larger network. The same impulse will later make Anatolia comfortable under Lydia's coin-based economy and Persia's satrapal roads. The Hittites were not building a royal road like the Persians would. They were rehearsing the idea. One more reveal. The biblical Hittites are not a single easy match to the Hittite empire of Hattusa. The Hebrew Bible mentions Hittites in Canaan, but those Ittim references often point to small Levantine groups, possibly descended in culture from North Syrian Hittite states, or simply using the label. The imperial Hittites did dominate northern Syria for a while and set up Carchemish as a royal seat, so the label migrated. But the tidy assumption that every biblical Hittite equals a citizen of Hattusa is a modern convenience, not an ancient truth. The empire's influence in labeling stuck around in the south, proof that names travel longer than queens do. Speaking of queens, Puduhepa's paper trail reads like a Bronze Age masterclass in soft power. Married to Hattusili III, daughter of a priest in Kizzuwatna, she ran litigation over sanctuaries, corresponded with Ramesses II, and his queen Nefertari, and orchestrated religious reforms. One letter from Puduhepe to the Egyptian queen drops protocol with finesse, acknowledging formal terms while sliding in personal warmth that sealed the treaty's durability. That style trained Anatolia in how royal women could act in politics. Later queens in Lydian and Persian contexts operate under different rules. But the idea that royal women negotiate cult and diplomacy has strong precedent on Anatolian soil. It is tempting to romanticize the Hittites into benevolent technocrats. The reality is more dramatic. They deported populations as punishment, or to solve labor shortages, a common imperial tactic that turns maps into spreadsheets of hostages. They crushed revolts with campaigns that burned towns and carried off the gods' statues, because stealing a local deity's image was like kidnapping its soul. Those tactics are baked into Hittite texts without apology. Influence includes the dark arts of empire, the normalization of moving people around as policy, the habit of capturing cult statues to neuter resistance, and the expectation that a great king's wrath could be a cross-regional weather pattern. Yet the empire's default was not endless war. It was stubborn continuity. That is why the archives exist. Hattusa taught Anatolia to treat memory as a state project. Scribes copied old laws with updates. They archived every treaty. They kept ritual calendars so thorough that modern scholars can reconstruct the religious year. When the empire died, that archival ethic did not vanish. Neo-Hittite and neighboring states took pieces of it. Even Greek historians, writing in classical times, treated Anatolia as a web of cities with old treaties in specific centuries, not a blank frontier. The ghost of a Hittite filing system stands behind that way of imagining space. The oblivion that followed the empire's collapse says something about the fragility of reputation. For centuries, the Hittites barely lived in collective memory outside specialist traditions, showing up in scattered Assyrian lists or in biblical notes. Anatolia moved on with Phrygian kings, Lydian mints, Persian satraps, and Hellenistic theatres. The stones at Hattusa kept their secrets until modern archaeology put the puzzle back together. That modern puzzle changed how scholars view Anatolia, not as a corridor between Mesopotamia and the Aegean, but as a center that shaped both directions. The Hittites are the proof. What lasts in Anatolia from Hittite influence can be summed up in 5 habits. 1. Write it down, including the awkward bits. 2. Turn local gods into a league rather than a war, and let the pantheon grow without needing to purge. 3. Run power through treaties and oaths, so that force always has paperwork. 4. Train the horses, because logistics win wars and festivals. 5. Build in stone with motifs that declare the state's myth in a single glance. Those habits made sense for the late Bronze Age world, but they keep popping up in Anatolia's later stories under different costumes and scripts. The empire's intellectual reach even touches modern linguistics beyond Indo-European bragging rights. Hittite texts keep alive a glimmer of pre-Indo-European Anatolia. Words and rituals labeled as Hattic survive inside Hittite rituals. Palaic prayers peek at a northern language, mostly lost otherwise. Luwian, close cousin to Hittite, shows a sound system and vocabulary that help reconstruct Proto-Anatolian, a branch of Indo-European that split early from the rest. Anatolia becomes a laboratory for deep linguistic time, and the Hittite archive is the freezer that kept the samples cool. The empire's Western interface sharpened a different kind of influence that later Greeks absorbed without credit. Hittite-style treaties and letters engaged directly with Aegean powers. The Hittite label, Ahiyawa, probably tags the wider Mycenaean sphere. When Hattusilier writes to the Ahiyawa ruler and calls him Great King, It signals a peer relationship. Western Anatolia learned how to stand between two great powers and extract concessions. The Saha Riverland, Mira, and Wilusa navigated loyalties the way later Ionian cities would between Lydia and Persia, and still later between Persia and Athens. The pattern repeats because the geography repeats. The Hittites helped write the playbook in its Bronze Age edition. Spin around to the north again, where the Casca tested the empire with guerrilla persistence. They burned Hattusa at least once before the empire period rebuilt. That cycle of destruction and reconstruction imprinted on the land, on a high plateau where timber stands and grain fields depend on winter snow. A state learned to be patient with ruin. Rebuilding became almost ritual. That ritual matters for Anatolia's resilience. Later peoples would rebuild Gordian, Sardis, and countless hilltop towns after Assyrian, Persian, and Macedonian armies tramped through. The Hittites taught the land that institutions can be reassembled even when the palaces go down. There is another layer to Hittite influence that sits in libraries rather than on walls. The Hittites translated and adapted Mesopotamian myth and ritual texts with a pragmatic hand. When they copied the Gilgamesh epic, they trimmed and reshaped. When they borrowed rituals from Hurrian or Hattic sources, they stuck Hittite incantations on them and standardized procedures. That approach, select, adapt, codify, became Anatolia's superpower across eras. Phrygians did it with Greek styles. Lydians did it with coinage technology and East-West aesthetics. Romans later did it with deities and provincial cults. The Hittites normalized the behavior. The empire's metallurgical reality puts a final nail in the iron myth, because the nuance says more about influence than the exaggeration. Bronze reigned, made with tin from far away, likely Central Asia via traders, or from Anatolian sources still under investigation, plus copper from local mines. The Hittite state's role was to keep trade routes safe enough and taxation precise enough that bronze production remained stable. Occasional iron prestige items did appear: daggers, ornaments, possibly smelted iron as well as meteorite iron, but rare. The influence sits in the administrative oversight of metals, weights, measures, contracts, and penalties for fraud. When coins arrived in Lydia in the 7th century Bars, a millennium after Hattusili I, Anatolia was already used to the state peeking over the scales. One more archaeological moment drives home the integration of ritual and environment. Spring sanctuaries, like Eflaton Punar pair stone reliefs, with hydraulic engineering in the Konya plain. The reliefs show divinities mounted on mountain symbols, while water gushes and pools. The message is cosmic order grounded in irrigation technology. The emperor as water manager is an image that persists. Later kings in Lydia and Persia will brag about canals, dams, and flood control. Hittite rulers like Tudhaliya carved their divine partnerships into stone while overseeing dam construction. Anatolia remembered that the good ruler is the one who keeps the springs behaving. Modern lab work keeps rewriting footnotes, and sometimes more than footnotes. The tree ring data already mentioned pushes climate into the center of collapse narratives. Stable isotope analyses from human and animal remains at Anatolian sites, refined diets, migration patterns, and stress events. Radiocarbon dating under Bayesian models tightens chronologies for destructions and rebuilds. Each new dataset tests assumptions about Hittite policy and its reach. The overarching picture still holds. A centrally organized state, mixing Indo-European language and Mesopotamian script, ran a vassal empire across Anatolia, normalized bureaucracy, harmonized gods, loved treaties, and fell around 1190 B. The details within that outline keep vibrating as new evidence lands on desks. The emotional core of Hittite influence comes through when reading the plague prayers of Mursili II. He narrates a kingdom's illness like a personal confession. Suppiluliuma, his father, brought Egyptian captives after campaigns in Syria. Then a plague arrived and stayed for years. Mursili prays to deities to lift it, listing sins, promising reforms, and pleading for mercy. The texts move between cosmic guilt and administrative problem-solving, between divine anger and tax shortfalls. Anatolia's identity as a place where the sacred and the practical argue in the same room is never clearer. That trait carries forward in sanctuaries turned market towns, in festivals that double as trade fairs, and in kings who declare piety at the same time they count sheep. Hittite influence on Anatolia is not a tale of perfect dominance. It is a catalogue of durable habits forged under pressure. The empire taught Anatolia that paperwork can tame war, that gods can share space without a knife fight, and that the state must constantly rebuild its house. It taught the West Coast to think in multiple scripts. It taught the interior to store grain by the temple and move water by decree. It taught the northern highlanders how to needle a giant until it flinched. It taught everyone that languages can share tablets without declaring civil war. Then it vanished so completely that its return in the 20th century felt like an anachronism. The punchline to this story is almost smug. The walls at Hattusa still run along the ridgelines. The Lion Gate stares at visitors with battered basalt eyes. The Sphinx Gate's guardians, after their little geopolitical vacation in Berlin, look out again over the Anatolian plateau. Uzilikai's gods file past, eternally, a stone calendar of divine egos. The archive rooms sit as roofless rectangles, as if the clerks might be back after lunch with a fresh batch of clay. And all across Anatolia, from rock reliefs near Izmir to dams near Sorum to bilingual stelae in the Cilician plain, the Hittite habit of making the ephemeral things permanent endures. Influence is what remains when the story ends. In Anatolia, the Hittites remain everywhere. The stones still speak. He does not walk away from this without the roll call of power players, because names anchor influence. Hattusili organized the core and made Hattusa a capital. Mursili pulled off the Babylon raid that made everyone look twice at a central Anatolian king. Telepinu wrote the edict that tried to stop royal blood from watering the throne room. Suppiluliuma, the empire's hard hitter, rebuilt Syrian hegemony, married diplomacy to intimidation, and accidentally imported a killer plague. Mursili stabilized with campaigns and prayers. Mu'tali too fought Egypt at Kadesh and shifted the capital south. Hattusili III turned a battlefield stalemate into the world's most famous peace treaty and corresponded with the Aegean like a man with a map on his desk and coffee in his veins. Puduhepa, queen and priestess, turned cult into policy and gave diplomacy a velvet glove that fit the iron fist. Tutaliaiv embanked springs, carved rock pantheons, and tried to keep the machine humming as the world frayed. These names anchored habits, and the habits outlived the names. The brief epilogue that Anatolia writes after the Hittites is essentially a love letter to their operating system. Phrygians under kings like Midas build citadels on hills and carve rock-cut facades that look back to the Hittite taste for monumental stone with cosmic themes. Lydians under Gages and Croesus mint coins that revolutionize economies, but also maintain the old habit of the state as measurer and guarantor. Persians arrive with satraps and a state postal road, and Anatolia slides into a more elaborate version of the Hittite message network. Greeks write about Carchemish, Tabal, and Cilicia's K without realizing how much of what they see is a Hittite afterimage. That is the measure of influence. The successors treat the old structures as the natural way a state behaves, forgetting where they learned it. The quietest echo of all sits in the phrase that made Hrozny famous: bread to eat, water to drink. Bronze Age officialdom reads dispassionate, but the basics hum underneath. The Hittites dragged law, logistics, and cosmic order into alignment, so that bread and water could reach cities across a landscape that can turn dry and hostile in a bad year. Anatolia learned to build states around that alignment. The seals, treaties, and stone gods are the visible interface. The deeper influence is a way of thinking about survival at scale. Nothing about this cancels the brutality, the deportations, the forced oath, and the campaigns that burn towns to ash. Influence is not sainthood. It is the set of tools a region keeps using. In ancient Anatolia, those tools had Hittite fingerprints. The empire rose, administered, negotiated, and collapsed. The land kept the toolkit. That is the Hittite legacy, a repertoire of governance, religion, and infrastructure that made Anatolia an engine of continuity in a world that liked to fall apart. Modern scholarship will keep sanding and repainting details. Epigraphers still debate the exact tone of Ahiawa relations. Archaeologists argue over the degree of astronomical intent at Izalikaya. Climate historians test new tree ring sequences and pollen cores. That churn is part of the Hittite afterlife, because the Hittites value documentation. Every new find slots into a puzzle the builders themselves started. The empire continues to administer its own memory from beyond the grave. Ancient Anatolia had many wardens, conquerors, and poets. The Hittites were the ones who taught it to think in oaths, measure in shekels, pray by a calendar, and carve gods into living rock. They were forgotten long enough to feel like a plot twist when rediscovered. They were present long enough to make forgetting them impossible once the evidence returned. And they still stand on their walls, stone eyes counting the caravans that are always about to appear around the bend. And now, let's continue with our next story. Day in the life of a Persian architect. You wait to the percussion of iron on limestone, the beat that started around 518 Bess and still hums through the terrace. The rumor in later centuries insists this place existed only to be torched by a Macedonian conqueror, and that nameless slaves groaned under the stones. The real paperwork in your storerooms pushes back with numbers, names, pay scales, and routes so long they redraw the map in your head. You step out into the morning at Parsa, the place Greeks eventually call Persepolis, the ceremonial complex of the Achaemenid kings, carved into a terrace the size of a small city block blown up to imperial scale. Under your feet is a platform with edges so crisp they catch sunlight like a blade. The terrace runs about 455 meters east to west, roughly 300 meters north to south, and rises up to 14 meters above the plain. Mud brick walls, stone revetments, voids infilled with tamped earth, drains cut like hidden arteries. You walk past a stormwater channel, incised into bedrock, that will carry seasonal floods away along more than a kilometer of carved shafts and stone-lined conduits. The sound is chisels, crowbars, ropes creaking, rollers bumping, the low thunder of drum-like column segments moving across the flat. It is work, music. You head toward the northern edge, where the Apadana is catching morning light on its fluted drums. The audience hall of Darius the Great and Xerxes I started as a sketch in power and became 72 columns anchored in limestone reality. 36 for the central hall, 36 for the 3 porticos. Each column is somewhere around 19 to 20 meters tall when fully erected, with a base that flowers and a top that transforms into paired animals to hold cedar beams in a clasp of stone. The columns, once bright painted, will eventually rise like a forest of light. Today, one more drum lifts inches at a time. You pass the clamp slots, those swallowtail cutouts in the stone where iron cramps will bite and then get sealed beneath poured lead. This is the Achaemenid version of zip ties you cannot see. The clamps, pinned in with molten metal, lock blocks, and stoppers of stone together against earthquake shivers and time. This is not magic. It is repetitive engineering, applied across a terrace that will eventually hold the gate of all nations, the Apadana, the Tripylon, the Treasury, the Tachara, the Hadish, and the Queen's Quarters, plus smaller service buildings. You are in the middle of a worksite that exists because Darius I decided the empire needed a stage that made every delegation feel the weight of order. You carry measuring cords coiled at your waist, cords set to cubits that do not lie. Achaemenid measurements lean on Mesopotamian standards shared across provinces. Rods, cubits, fingers, set by stones in satrapal treasuries, and checked by inspectors whose titles do not sound poetic, but whose authority could lock a caravan at the border until its loads reconcile with papyrus and clay. A morning breeze slides over Mount Rahmat to your south. Not a poetic name, but a literal place, the ridge that frames the terrace and the plain beyond, where irrigation channels glint and barley fields plotted under satrapal quotas shake in the wind. You take a moment to run your fingers over the face of a relief panel laid out near the Apadana's northern staircase. The rosette borders are precise. 16 petals in a near fractal field. The lotus and palmettes are standardized. The stone reads like a manual in geometry. The Apadana's north and east staircases will end up as billboard-length statements carved with processions of tribute-bearing delegations, usually counted at 23 distinct groups, each identifiable by hair, hats, shoes, and the gifts they carry. Lydians with shallow bowls and metal bracelets, Indians with gold dust in linen bags and a pair of tiny humped cattle, Nubians with ivory tusks and an okapi-like wonder from the edge of empire that looks absurd and exactly right, Scythians in tucked trousers with patterned quivers. The release are not random. They are a carved solution to a political problem. How to turn 100 peoples into one story where they all walk toward the king and nobody trips. You step into the Apadana precinct's shade. Well, proto-shade. Today it is scaffolds and partial uprights. Darius launched this project in the last decade of the 6th century BY, and Xerxes will finish it in the 5th. You have notes in your head from inscriptions that sit in stone boxes beneath corners of buildings. Trilingual plates of gold and silver discovered in the 1930s by the Oriental Institute's teams under Ernst Herzfeld and later Erich Schmidt. Those plates speak in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. They credit Ahura Mazda. They list materials and their far-flung origins. Cedar from Lebanon, gold from Sardis and Bactria, lapis and carnelian from Sogdiana, turquoise from Chorasmia, silver and ebony from Egypt, ivory from Nubia and India, and Arachosia, decoration by Ionian workers. The text collapses distance into bragging rights. The reality standing in front of you is cedar beams so long, you count them in double cubits and rope lengths. Cedar smells like a shipwright's dream when a fresh beam is cut open, and your crews love that. The beams come in on routes that cross mountains and rivers in segments measured in weeks. They move from Levantine coastal saw pits into Phoenician hulls, up the Euphrates or overland in caravans through Syria, toll-stamped at border houses, tallied at the satrapal capital of Susa. From Susa, they come east to Parsa, scuffed but intact, capped with wet rags under leather to prevent splits. Bureaucracy does not sound exciting, But without those root marks and seals, a cedar beam of exactly 15 meters snaps into rumor rather than building. You run your hand along weathered wood and think about how empire is logistics with a manifesto. Your morning turns into measurement. The columns do not align themselves. You follow scribe marks incised in Aramaic numerals near the footings, faint letters and tallies that guide placement of each drum. Aramaic is the empire's office language. Wide, quick and efficient. Stamped into clay, written on leather or wood, sealed with cylinder stamps that pull along tiny narratives of heroes grappling with lions and bulls. Old Persian script shows up in royal proclamations, those crisp wedge strokes invented in Darius's era, to spell out the king's power in shapes that almost any literate courtier could learn. But the day-to-day is Elamite and Aramaic. Your life is trilingual whether the breakfast porridge knows that or not. The stone surface underfoot is limestone from local quarries, carved from the mountain behind the terrace. Quarry marks line the blocks. One mark is a V, another a pair of strokes like a tally, kept by a hurried artisan on a rushed day. The grooves cut along the block's sides are not decoration. They are Lewis holes and lifting grips. Ropes run through them. Wooden sledges and rollers handle weight measured not in body strength, but in oxen loads and lever arms. You stand near a drum that weighs as much as a modern trucking load, 15 or 20 tons, and listen to the team leader call cadence. No theatrical shouts exist in your world this morning, just steady commands, and the drum's slow upward slide on a ramp, packed with sand and agricultural waste, pressed into something that behaves like asphalt when the sun hits it. The worksite runs on rations and pay of a type that gets misremembered in later centuries. This is where your day is fact-checking, as much as stone-checking. The Persepolis fortification tablets, discovered and published by scholars from the Oriental Institute beginning in the 1930s, and expanded by ongoing research, record more than 20,000 clay tablets and fragments in Elamite and other languages. They date largely to Darius's regnal years 13 to 28, approximately 509 to 494 BC. They document rations of grain, wine, beer, fruit, and animals given to workers and travelers. They list names: Persian, Elamite, Babylonian, Egyptian, Greek. So many names that you can smell a payroll office. Women appear as laborers, supervisors, and family heads, drawing rations for children. One tablet records increased allocations during pregnancy and after childbirth, not theory. Receipts. The empire is not a labor union utopia. No illusions about hierarchy. But the evidence refuses the lazy late summer myth of anonymous slave hordes dragging stones until they collapse. Workers called Kurtash get rations that scale with skill, status, and season, and their overseers file receipts that auditors can and do check. The paperwork is not romance. It is real life. You move through the Apadana's North Gate area, where one of the Lamassu-adjacent sculptures will not actually be a Lamassu, because this is not Assyria, even though you admire their sculptural paranoia. What you will get at the Gate of All Nations, Xerxes' addition, are monumental bulls with human detail, guardians that make the entrance feel like a checkpoint run by two angry zodiac signs. For now, you sketch and measure the embossed blocks that will hold them. The bulls will come later, carved by teams far more than one. The style is borrowed, filtered, standardized, Persianized. Under terrace's edges, you check the drains again, because a palace is only as immortal as its plumbing. Stone blocks cover the channels. They run like secret roads under floors where courtiers will glide. You think about seasonality. Winter rains out of the Zagros can turn the plateau into a sponge. The drains need to carry a sudden release of water without undermining footings. You push a stick into a channel and pull it back wet. Flow is good. This is the kind of moment that never makes it into inscriptions. The gods get the credit, but carpenters and stonemasons keep the floors dry. You walk past the Tripylon site, a smaller palace-like building that will become a kind of connector between the Apadana and the private palaces. Later scholars will name it Tripylon or Council Hall. Reliefs here will show something you file away as a design thesis. Representatives of different peoples holding up the king's throne, not abstract, literally carved people shouldering the platform. Their garments identifiable by region. Forces of empire turned into support architecture. The visual grammar is not subtle. Power is heavy. Everyone you rule lifts together. You do not need a caption to translate this to the men who cut the stone. In the mid-morning you drift toward the treasury, a complex of storerooms and offices that will eventually cover over 10,000 square meters with thick mud brick walls. The treasury pulls in what the Apadana displays. It is the back office to the front stage. One day, after a Macedonian victory at Gaugamela in 331 Bay, and a march down the spine of the empire, this space will cough up wealth described in tonnage by Greek writers. Modern estimates put the Achaemenid treasury across the empire in tens of thousands of talents of silver, with one talent roughly 26 to 30 kilograms. Even if Herodotus is prone to inflation, the scale is not small. Today, though, your business here is paperwork, not piles of plate. You step into a room where clay tablets are stacked on shelves, chalky rectangles wrapped in straw and marked with seals. A scribe sits with a stylus, turning lines of Elamite into rations that will flow down the hill. Names like Parnaka, Pharnaka, Pharnacis appear, high officials who authorize transfers of grain and oil. Another name flickers in the lines as if it belongs to an entrepreneur in a modern logistics firm. Idabama, a Persian woman whose estate spans districts and whose workforce gets rations, tallied on tablets that mention her by name in Elamite text and Aramaic notes. She moves people and goods across provinces and appears in dozens of tablets. She does not exist as a legend. She exists on receipts. You check a tablet that lists wine allocations to messengers, the amounts measured in units that scholars translate into liters only after a couple of lifetimes of disagreement. The numbers vary by job and distance. A man driving a donkey load across district lines gets more wine than the clerk who warms a bench. The tablet uses seals you've seen before. A hero kneeling on a lion, a pair of winged something, and the sight of them is a whole biography of administrative taste. Someone commissioned those seals. They might be passed down. They might be the property of an office, not a person. The empire is a hierarchy of stamps. What you oversee is not only stone and wood, it is choreography. Look at the Apadana staircases again. The rises are so low that stepping up feels like gliding. Steps average around 10 centimeters in rise, generous in run, designed so a procession can move in long robes without tripping. So delegations in elaborate hats can keep their dignity while the entire courtyard watches them not fall on their faces in front of the king. This is the detail that delivers the effect. The more than 200 low steps wind you toward reliefs, where the guards, the so-called immortals of popular imagination, stand with spears and beards that never end. In reality, the elite infantry under the Achaemenids did not wear name tags that said immortal. Herodotus provides that flourish. Archaeology gives you carved guards and glazed brick arches from Susa with color, so electric that even centuries later the blue pops. Color is your afternoon obsession. Before midday heat, turns every stone into a stove. Many modern visitors imagine Persepolis as a monochrome ruin. Today it is not. Pigments cling to crevices where the sun does not reach between 11 and 2. Egyptian blue, red ochre, yellow, black details for hair and pupils. On door jambs and capitals, paint soaks into the carved planes and hides without light. You walk with a pot of wash and a cloth, wiping dust that dulls residue. Modern conservators use microscopes to pick at flakes. You have a more direct method. You meet to know where the paint will hold. By midday, an ox train arrives with another cedar. The timing is good. Your teams are ready for a lift. A ramp curves up to the Apadana's north edge, like an earthen causeway. The ramp is not guesswork. Herodotus describes ramps used by Persians and others to move stone in other contexts. You have built them all over the terrace. The trick is friction management. Logs under sledges, wet clay on wood to reduce burn. A chorus of men hauling on ropes, twisted from palm fiber and hair. You log the beam's length, its knots, its end splits, its weight, relative to what a pair of bull capitals can support. The capitals, when they finally crown, will lock beams in a way that modern viewers love to call unique, even though versions of paired animal capitals appear in Elam and Assyria. Your job is to make them Achaemenid, which is to say clean, scaled, symmetrical, with standardized reverse curved volutes and a shoulder line you could draw with your eyes closed. Break turns into heat. You duck into the Tachera's shadow, the small palace of Darius on the south side, with a stone floor, polished like it wants to reflect the sky. The Tachera's doorway, jambs carry carved royal figures wearing tall, rounded crowns, holding lotuses, stepping out in ceremonial stillness. The old Persian inscriptions on the jambs include that line that repeats like a creed. By the favor of Ahura Mazda, Darius the king built this palace. The wood for the roof beams came from Lebanon. The gold decoration came from Sardis and Bactria. The stone came from quarries named by scribes, who have not set foot here but copy lines dictated by administrators who know the difference between talk and delivery. You touch the stone and feel the polish that took hours and hours of abrasive sand and water to bring up. You think about the geometric patience that shapes an empire's face. You spend part of early afternoon dealing with tooling marks. An Ionian artisan crew has sent up sample carving for a griffin capital. They propose for one of the smaller halls. The griffin design flirts with Greek and Anatolian motifs, but lands squarely in Persian style. Bodies smoothed, wing feathers regular, the beak stylized to fit a beam. These are not uninvited Greeks. They are contracted specialists, documented in the fortification tablets, and supported by rations issued along with local crews. Names like Bagger something and Olo something show up side by side in Elamite lines that lock cultures together whether politics are easy or not. The Greek mainland and the empire will collide violently in the coming decades. But on this terrace in the late 6th century, Bars, the workshop includes Ionians, Lydians, Medes, Egyptians, and Persians cutting the same limestone to the same standard, because you enforce it. That standard is measurable. You use mason squares and plumb bobs to check perpendicular and vertical lines. You use cords with knots to check spacing of flutes on a column shaft. The flutes must present a consistent shadow under the sun. They are not decorative kindness. They are geometry turned into an amplifier of light. A fluted column under high sun becomes a rhythm of shade that makes a hall look cooler than it is, not metaphorically, but literally, when the air slides along the grooves and stays moving. You check the edges of the step nosings where low stairs meet the sun. Each edge should throw a thin shadow that makes the step read clearly to eyes tired from walking. The more tired a delegation is, the better they need those shadow lines to avoid. a mishap on the approach. You design for human factors, even if half your scribes would not recognize the term, and the other half would turn it into an Enite loanword in 15 minutes. You head to the gate of All Nations site. Mid-afternoon, partly because a relief carver begs for clarity on the eyebrow angle of a giant bull that does not yet exist, and partly because you need the breeze. Xerxes will stamp his name on this gate with a trilingual inscription. The gate proper will have a square central hall with 4 columns and 3 tall doorways, capped by colossal bulls, each with a humanish head in style, borrowed and adapted from Mesopotamian gate guardians. Each creature will weigh tens of tons. Their weight lands on foundation blocks that spread the load smoothly enough that annual groundswell does not turn their faces into fault lines. You look at the corner where a foundation deposit box will sit, filled with beads, coins in later builds, and, most importantly, a trilingual inscription about the king's authority dropped into a trench like a guarantee. You do not run a temple here. Despite later narratives, Persepolis is not a city with bustling markets and domestic courtyards. It is a monumental ceremonial complex. Imperial capitals are mobile in this period. Ecbatana, Susa, Babylon and Pasargadae each serve administrative and ceremonial roles, shifting with seasons and the court. The notion of a single fixed capital reflects a later mindset. Here, your logistics run to seasonal festivals and imperial audiences. Modern scholarship has debated the degree to which Nowruz, the New Year, was celebrated here. The evidence is suggestive rather than definitive. The Apadana's design reads like a stage set for a universal festival, but no ancient text spells out a schedule posted on a bulletin board. You plan for large gatherings anyway. You look north across the terrace, into the plain, where caravans trace habit patterns the way ants do. The view is a payoff, built into the site selection. Darius chose Parsa not because the farmland is unmatched. It is good, not divine, but because the rock provides a canvas and the location sits in Fars, the homeland of the Persian tribe. A place where the dynasty can say with stone what it claims in ideology. You build here to be seen by people whose job is to carry the story outward to Susa and Sardis and beyond. You have a break long enough to watch carvers at the Apadana's eastern stair. They cut small ridges into carved beards, each curl deep enough to catch paint. They incise the pattern on a robe taken from Media or Bactria, so precisely that later visitors will identify the region by textile. This is a museum, with labels carved in stone. The scene includes a lion grabbing a bull from behind, a common motif in Iranian art that has launched enough interpretations to fuel a decade of dissertations. Some say it speaks to astronomical cycles, some to a symbolic cosmic conflict that frames royal power. You like it because it looks like a freeze frame from a Predator documentary. You insist that the lion's paw pads get carved. The detail sells the anatomy sells the weight. A messenger trots past released from an office you know only by the smell of clay dust and reed. He carries a wooden tablet coated with wax, a note that will be erased and reused and forgotten. It is a different kind of literacy than the clay that sits hardened in shelves. Like a library of facts, the wax notes will disappear. The clay will become a stubborn voice that outtalks 30 empires. Your buildings will too, up to a point. Early evening slides into the plain, and you walk to the southern edge of the terrace to look at the Haddish site, the palace of Xerxes. It will be bigger than the Tachira, but recognizable in plan. Hypostyle hall, porticos, stairs, doorways with frames cut from precise blocks, floors that want to reflect, door jambs carved with royal presence, a labyrinth of small rooms for storage and business. Many of the wooden beams and doors here will burn in a final spectacular event after the conquest by Alexander of Macedon in 330 BC. Accounts by Greek writers describe a fire that eats the complex. Archaeology shows charring and collapsed stone, not total annihilation. Massive carved blocks survive, fallen, scorched. Reliefs on the Apadana steps endure because they moved earlier to the treasury and were protected. Stone remembers what flame cannot digest. Myth correction slides into you like a habit. People who write their history 2 centuries after events. Love drama. They talk about the king's court filled with 1,000 immortals, everything encrusted with gold, and the palace so drunk on festival wine that it begged for a torch. The truth is complicated. The invader did take a staggering amount of bullion and portable art from Persepolis. The treasury evidence is charred. The fire happened. But the system that built this place was not a fever dream. It was logistics, itinerary, and standardized measurements. It was quarry marks and ration lines. It was migration of specialists across mountains. It was design that anticipates the movement of thousands upstairs, that kindly refuse to trip them. It was careful drains that still carry water 2 millennia later. The drama sits on top of day after day work you touch with your hands. You take one last walk through the Apadana's central area, where columns are just tall enough to throw thin evening shadows like giant sundials. Your eye notices mistakes. The shop wants to call them idiosyncrasies. You call them excuses. A flute is a millimeter shallow at the transition. A rosette petal is cramped. These are the places where your red chalk marks will appear in the morning to signal corrections. The workshops respect red chalk. It means redo. You glance at the stair relief again. The delegations, frozen mid-step. Some later viewers will imagine that each delegation shows the exact actual gifts delivered in a specific year. The evidence says the scenes work as an idealized composite of tribute and honor gifts. The point is the behavior, not the audit list. The presence of a single camel is an anecdote. The repetition of bowing figures with hands linked, carrying objects capable of fitting into the treasury's storage, is policy. This carved film is not a documentary. It is propaganda. But watch how precisely it gets the small truths right. Hair, jewelry, shoes. They humanize empire. In a way numbers cannot. A chill runs out of the limestone as the sun clears the edge of Mount Rahat and slides into the valley. You stand by a doorway with an old Persian inscription carved by order of a king who knows exactly how long stone can last compared to skin. The script reads like a brand. The words say the king builds by the favor of Ahura Mazda. The syntax is rigid and proud, and you can see how later kings will copy it like a legal formula. The formula is powerful. It welds divinity to construction. It turns good drainage into proof of cosmic order. You run through the day's numbers in your head because that is your preferred lullaby. The terrace covers roughly 125,000 square meters. The Apadana will hold 72 columns when done, each around 19 meters tall. The gate of All Nations Center Hall will carry 4 columns, and its bulls will weigh more than 20 tons each. The treasury will cover over a hectare of ground. The fortification tablets cover the years 500 and 9,400 and 9,4 Bess and survive in the tens of thousands. The subject delegations on the Apadana stairs are usually counted at 23 groups. The stairs have rises around 10 centimeters. The clamps are iron set in lead. The beams are cedar from Lebanon, maybe some teak from India, Cyprus, and local woods as needed. The workers pull rations in measured units that match standards stamped into weights in satrapal treasuries. Achaemenid architecture is a list of details that look small until you remove one, and then everything comes apart. You have a final errand at the Treasury's archive room. The tablet you checked earlier needs to be filed with a seal. You take the cylinder stamp and roll it across the wet clay of a docket. The image is yours only for a moment as it cuts across the clay, leaving a gnarled hero controlling a beast with a grip that reads like a metaphor for administrative violence. There is an appropriateness in that you cannot shake. The beast is chaos. Your job is a firm hold. The cylinder makes a track that the sun can hit tomorrow before it hardens into time. You put the tablet on the shelf. The wax notes in your pocket will fade by morning. The clay will not. You leave the archives and walk slowly past the spot where the foundation deposit box, under the Apadana's northeast corner, rests out of sight, inches under your feet. In 1933, modern archaeologists will lift its lid and pull out gold and silver plates with trilingual inscriptions that confirm what the stones whisper every day. They will also find beads and small objects that reveal taste and the desire to embed meaning under a building. You know none of that in a modern sense. You know that the ground you step on has a dedication in its belly. You end your day at the edge of the terrace where the northern staircase of the Apadana meets the plain. The steps look gentle in this light. You pick up a chunk of pigment someone dropped, a blue that probably came from a recipe that includes copper silicate, one of the earliest man-made colors used in the region. Egyptian blue does not glow until under the right light. It glows under this. You imagine the whole staircase lit by late sun, the carved robes and braided hairlines throwing small shadows, the rosette bands ticking by like entries on a ledger. You have seen spreadsheets. They are clay tablets with columns and numbers. You have touched this ledger with your hands all day. A gust of wind carries dust up the stairs, like a small movie of the future. Everything gets covered eventually. In 330 Alexander will take this place, and the treasury will become a wealth distribution center with an exit sign. There will be a fire. There will be a hangover of myths, including one that everything here burns to ash. It does not. Enough stone survives that more than 2,000 years later. Archaeologists will count clamps and flutes and read the carved clothes of Lydians and Scythians like a costume inventory. Debates will flare about function, ritual, timing, and meaning. The one thing not up for debate is that this place is the result of designed thinking, executed at imperial scale. You are the kind of person who measures reliefs with his eye, from the base to the crown, and keeps the numbers in your head like a poem. You notice that the shoes of one figure line up with the fingers of the next, because a carver shaped the rhythm consciously. The carvings begin to hum when the alignment hits that sweet point where the entire staircase becomes a wave. You lean against warm stone and let your back take the heat. A worker hustles past with a sling of tools, iron ends clacking, headed toward a workshop where sharpening stones will sing for another hour. The tools matter as much as the vision. The chisels here are iron. Bronze chisels would fail on this limestone. The iron heads have to be quenched and tempered, and handled by men who understand when to stop. Light drains. The Apadana's columns turn into silhouettes, and the paired animal capitals in your mind unfold into reality. A bull head the size of a car holds a cedar beam as if it is a twig. Those beams will keep the roof up for a century or two, until they do not. Roofs are the first victims of time and fire. The stone below them outlives both. Your day worked to focus weight-down columns, to pads, to footings, to bedrock. The entire empire flows through that sequence, from remote mountain to beam to clamp to column down to ground. This is both literal and symbolic. You smile at the thought that the symbolism is unavoidable when the literal is this heavy. In the city below, ovens glow, and the smell of spiced stews floats up. Workers will eat rations tonight, warmed up with whatever spice mixes they can afford or barter. They will drink wine or beer measured against their receipts. They will tell stories about the bosses and the exactness of your chalk lines, and how you insist that a rosette must run a clean circle every time. And then they will wake and do it again, because the terrace is hungry and will be for a decade or more. The pace does not accelerate, just because a king wants it to. The stone does not care about impatience. You watch the plain darken, and you think in dates because that is how you control the drift of time in your mind. Cyrus II, called the Great, captured Babylon in 539 BC and reorganized the world. He built Pasargadae north of here. Darius I took power in 522 BC during a crisis held together with spears. He began this terrace around 518 BC. You are building in his time. Xerxes will continue. Artaxerxes will add. The dynastic line will etch names on door jambs and collaborative muscle into your stone. In the 5th century BC, Greek wars will flare, and names like Marathon in 490 BC and Salamis in 480 BC will land on these stones like thumps heard from far away. In 330 BC, Alexander will set a torch after raiding the treasury. Centuries will pass, and the terrace will sit under dust and goat pass until 17th and 18th century travelers sketch it into European curiosity, and then 20th century archaeologists peel it back carefully with numbers and photos and reports that weave through footnotes like irrigation channels. Your day at Persepolis started with chisels and ends with history as a weight on your chest, not a burden but a literal sensation of the stone's presence. You know you are not an anonymous cog, even if your name will never be etched in letters anyone reads centuries hence. The fortification tablets will capture bureaucrats and travellers and contractors and mothers collecting barley shares for children. Your chalk lines will fade. The clamp slots you checked this morning will stay hidden under lead plugs until a conservator's scalpel in 1935 pops. One loose for a photograph that ends up in a report at the Oriental Institute's library. In Chicago, all of this is funny in a quiet way. You work to create something that will look inevitable when it is done. The sweat is replaced by aura. People will stand here and talk about empire and symbol and style and get most of it right. You step down those gentle stairs into the last light. The plains irrigation ditches gleam, each a line that says stability to a farmer whose reality has nothing to do with bulls on columns and everything to do with not losing a crop to drought. Empire and terrace exist for the fields and for the taxes the fields produce, and for the narrative that turns taxes into power, into architecture, into an inscription that says, the king made this with the favor of the highest deity. Your job is to make the inscription true in stone. The wind tastes like dust and cedar resin. You tuck the piece of blue into a fold in your belt because you have a weakness for color samples. You walk past a stack of column drums that you know weigh 12 tons because you counted the oxen needed to move them, and you pass a carpenter measuring a beam with a cord whose knots match yours. The sky is clean, except for a thin smear of smoke off cooking fires. You pause at the foot of the terrace and look back. Without paint, the bones look even more correct. The rhythms snap into place. The stillness is not a lack of motion. It is potential energy. Night falls. You carry the day's dust into your sleeping space and let it settle with the rest. Tomorrow will be another loop of this, and then another, until the hall is a forest and the gate roars and the treasury groans. You will bandage a hand cut by a metal clamp, swallowing a rope. You will adjust a staircase angle by less than a fraction of a finger. You will tie another knot in a cord. The myth will be someone else's problem. You live by the stone, the numbers, the rations, and the light. As second person in this story, you are not fiction. You are the human necessary to make this look inevitable. A last thought before sleep. Somewhere not far off across the plain, at Naxxarostum, the high rock face will carry the tomb of Darius. Cut in a cross-shaped facade gabled like a palace front, it will carry an inscription, Dina, where the king speaks about who he is and the lands that obey. He will list peoples the way you list tools. He will say he is a friend of right and an enemy of wrong. He will say his God's favor made this possible. He will say he built. The grammar of the empire is clean. You know how to diagram it with stones resolved into loads that flow into footings. You believed before you even touched your first clamp that this is how permanence is made. Sleep, then. You are building a sentence whose subject is a king and whose verb is built. The rest of the words are weight, angles, rations, paint, sweat, and a sunset. Tomorrow the chisels begin again. And this terrace asks the same question. It asks every morning in a voice you no longer hear because you answer it all day long. It demands evidence, not excuses. You are good at evidence. You keep its receipts. You make it heavy and beautiful. And when the last light hits the stairs, quietly inevitable, in the morning, you will check the drains again. You will run your palm over a new drum and make your hand dusty with the stone's chalk. You will pace the width of the Apadana and hear numbers hum. You will pass a scribe tallying oil for workers from Lydia and a messenger bound for Susa with a wax note. You will glance up at a beam and picture the bulls holding it, then do the hard math to see if your iron clamps are sufficient. You will step onto a stair that is as kind to your calves as it is unforgiving to half measures. You will be, again, exactly what this place needs most. A human who keeps the myth out and the measurements in. Sources you can live with run in your head like a whisper. Oriental Institute excavations under Eric Schmidt, 1933 to 1939. The Persepolis Fortification Archive and its Elamite tablets documenting rations, workers, and routes, dating 509 to 409 to 4 by. Darius's trilingual inscriptions, including those on gold and silver foundation tablets, found in situ beneath the Apadana and other buildings. Measured plans and dimensions published by early scholars like Ernst Herzfeld and by later analysts who counted every flute and clamp and recounted them again, because that is how accuracy gets born. The debate over function, summarized by Pierre Brandt, Amélie Court, and Margaret Root. These are not exotic talismans. They are the paperwork behind your life. The night is cool, and the terrace breathes like a sleeping paddle of stone under a blanket of dust. The stars are bright. You think about how even the sky is a grid tonight. You drift off inside a set of numbers that hold together across centuries. 72 columns, 23 delegations, 455 by 300 meters. Years 518 batch. Onward. Darius and Xerxes, cedar and clamps, lead and iron, low steps, high shadows. Tomorrow we'll test each of them again. The terrace will be here in the morning. It demands it. You will answer.